One night in 1943, a Catholic priest named Father Paul Lebout was getting ready for bed in the back room of his church in Paris, France, when he heard the doorbell ring. And Father Paul was quite surprised by this because, number one, it was almost midnight, and number two, World War II was going on. Paris was occupied by the Nazis, and the whole city was under a very strict curfew. So if somebody was here, they're breaking that curfew, but it also meant if somebody was here breaking the curfew to talk to him at midnight, it must be urgent. So he rushed to the door to see who it was. And when he opened up the church door, he saw this frantic-looking middle-aged woman who was standing out on the steps, and she looked totally panicked. She told Father Paul to please come quickly because a young man was dying and he needed someone to say his last rites. Father Paul instinctively poked his head out the door and just looked up and down the road. He was scanning the street outside for soldiers or police. He knew that if he and this woman were spotted out past curfew, they'd be arrested. And so obviously this would be a huge risk to do what she was asking. But to Father Paul, if someone was dying, he had to go. He had to let this person have their last rites. Now, Father Paul knew it would be safest if he and this woman actually traveled separately to where this young man was. So Father Paul, he pulled out a notebook and he told this woman to write down the address. So she did, and then he took the note and he said he'd be over there in a few minutes. And then he rushed inside to grab his coat while she took off running down the road. Not long after that, Father Paul hurried down this pitch black street full of all these old limestone buildings, scanning for the address the woman had written down on this piece of paper. He eventually found the building number and he rushed up and he knocked on the door because he needs to get off the street as fast as possible here, like he's breaking curfew. And the woman, she's not here yet, he doesn't see her outside anyways, there's nobody outside. And so he's knocking on the door and he sees through the window that a light comes on inside. And then he saw these thick curtains inside of this apartment. They parted slightly and someone looked out, and then a moment later, the door opened slightly. And immediately, Father Paul basically pushed himself into the apartment. He doesn't even know who's in here, but he needs to get inside because it's not safe outside. And so Father Paul gets inside and he looks and he sees there's a young man standing there who's just let him in. This is presumably his apartment. And Father Paul doesn't see the woman who had, told him to come here. But also Father Paul's realizing I don't see any sign of somebody dying here. And so it's sort of like this weird, what's going on here? The young man's looking at Father Paul, what is this? And vice versa. And Father Paul, he's like, I was given this address to come give someone their last rites. I was told by a woman that there's somebody dying here. Is there someone dying here? And the young man, he's sort of looking at Father Paul and just sort of looking all around him. And he's like, no, I'm the only one here. I have no idea what you're talking about. And so Father Paul, he's like, well, wait a minute. Is this the right address? Am I at the right address? Because this woman, she was convinced somebody was dying here. Is this the right address? And the young man, he looks at the address and he's like, yeah, no, that's definitely right. You're at the right address. And so Father Paul's like, how weird is that? Are you sure there's nobody here that's dying? And the young man's like, no, really, it's just me. I have no idea what this is about. And so Father Paul, he told this young man, hey, let's just wait a minute because this woman is bound to show up any minute. I mean, she's the one who told me to come here. She's the one who said somebody was dying. When she gets here, we'll let her in and she can explain, what happened. But the two of them, they just sort of awkwardly stood there inside of this apartment, looking out the window, waiting for this woman. But quite a bit of time went by and she never showed up. And so eventually the two of them, the father and this young man, they're like, man, that is weird. It's just a mix-up, I guess. What else could it be? He's at the right address. There is a man here, but he's clearly okay. It was a weird thing. And so Father Paul and this young man, they just sort of talked about how weird this was. And the father was about to leave when the young man is like, hey, wait a minute. Since you're here, I haven't spoken to a priest in a long time. And, given what's going on in the world, I'd love to be able to speak to you and confess my sins. Would you be willing to just stay here for a minute and just let me speak to you? And Father Paul's like, of course, I'm here and already intruded into your home. Of course. And so the two of them, they would sit down inside of the apartment. The woman, she never shows up. These two, complete strangers, basically, just talked for a while. The young man confessed. He got his burdens off his mind and got right with God, in a sense. And eventually, after, his confessional was done, the priest thanked the young man, wished him well, and then he went back outside. And immediately, when the father was outside, it had been pretty quiet to that point, but the second he got out there onto the road, the air raid sirens began going off all through the city. And so at this point, Father Paul had a decision to make. Either run home as he planned to and just take shelter inside of his own home and hope he survived the inevitable bombing run that apparently was coming through any minute now. That's what the sirens were for. Or, given the sirens going off, he knew anytime that happened, if there was a bombing run that followed, dozens and dozens of people were going to get killed. That's how it always went. And they had these things in the city called casualty clearing centers, which were like these intermediary spots before folks got sent to hospitals, which could become overwhelmed really quickly with casualties, where at these clearing centers, officials would basically determine whether or not somebody was salvageable. And Father Paul knew these clearing centers really needed a lot of priests to give last rites and to provide their spiritual services to these people that are, casualties of war. And so for Father Paul, as the sirens are going off, for him, the decision was easy. He turned and he ran right towards that clearing center. And as Father Paul got closer to the clearing center, he was already hearing the sound of bombs impacting buildings and streets not far away from him. Like he's basically running through an air raid. He eventually makes it to this shelter area, this clearing center. He rushes inside, and when he gets in there, he finds that it's actually already really crowded with patients lying on stretchers or huddled on the floor, and nurses were rushing back and forth with bandages and medicine. It was just like this horrifying, chaotic scene. And this is like before a rush of new casualties had even arrived. Like the bombing's happening now. These people are just leftovers, from the last round of attacks. These are people that got passed over, if you will, and were told to stay here and not be sent to the hospital. And so this place is already basically full of dying and mortally wounded people. And very shortly after Father Paul got in there, another rush of freshly injured people from this particular bombing run began being rushed inside. I mean, it was total madness. And so for the next few hours, Father Paul just went all around this clearing center looking for the people who were the most critically injured, who were the least likely to survive the night. And he would pray with them in their final moments. Then, a little before dawn, Father Paul saw one victim who just completely stopped him in his tracks. It was this young man who was obviously deceased, who was lying on the ground with brutal injuries all over his body. And it was the same young man who Father Paul had seen at that random address he had run to, believing he was going to find a dying man, That same young man who was healthy, who was fine, who did his confession to Father Paul, that young man is dead inside of this clearing center, clearly killed by the most recent bombing run. Now, Father Paul had been witnessing war like the rest of the residents of Paris for some time, but he was still just really shaken up by this. He knew very likely, considering this young man lived alone, that he, Father Paul, was the last person to speak to him before he died. And so in some ways, he was very grateful that the young man had asked him to stay back and allow him to confess and get right with God, because it turned out he was about to die. And so Father Paul, he just, without really knowing what else to do, he began reaching into this young man's pockets to, find hopefully a wallet or just any of his valuables, just to make sure he could return these things to this young man's family, so that way he could not only give these things back to them, but also, pay his condolences and tell the family that, he did have a chance to see their son, their brother, before he died. He wanted to do that for the family. And eventually, Father Paul pulled out this man's wallet. And when he opened it, in addition to his ID and a few other things, he found 2 photos. The first was of this middle-aged woman, and on the back of this photo was a single word. It just said "mom," but written in French. And at first, Father Paul really didn't think twice about this, but when he flipped the photograph back over and looked at the image again, looked at this woman again, he realized this was the woman who had come to his church to say, you have to go give this dying man his last rites, the woman who never showed up at the address. It's his mother. Like, how could this be? How could she have known he was gonna die? Like, what's going on here? And so Father Paul really doesn't know what to even think here. I mean, this is like truly unbelievable. But it only got weirder. He looked at the second photo in this young man's wallet, and this photo as well was of his mother. Except in this photo, his mother was clearly dead. She was laying in a coffin with a crucifix wrapped around her hands that were resting on her chest like she's dead. And this photo, the photo of her dead, was dated on the back, April 8th, 1939, which meant this woman that Father Paul saw at his church that night, who led him to the young man who wound up dying in the bombing run, that woman had died 4 years ago. Father Paul would ultimately contact the family of this young man, and he confirmed that the pictures were definitely his mother and that she really had died 4 years earlier. And also, Father Paul requested a sample of this young man's mother's handwriting to compare the address that he was given by this woman to a known sample of her handwriting. And the handwriting matched exactly. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Every once in a while, something will remind me of a time when staying connected with people just felt a whole lot more effortless. There was less planning, fewer distractions, and somehow there was just way more time for the people around you. And so when I look back at those times, it's hard not to wish I had sort of appreciated those times more when they were happening. When something feels off in your life, you may find yourself thinking about a simpler time in the past when, relationships felt more natural, when being around people didn't seem to require so much effort. And then you sort of look at your current life and think, boy, it really feels different now. Staying connected in some ways is super automatic with social media and the internet, but it doesn't feel natural. It doesn't feel effortless like it used to. But what you're often missing when you look back at this time isn't just those people. It's really the experience of connection with them feeling so effortless. Therapy can help you make sense of what's changed and may also help you recognize and nurture the connection that's still very much available to you today, even if it doesn't look exactly the way it once did. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. Switch anytime at no extra cost if it's not the right fit. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/Mrballen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. On the morning of March 17th, 2019, a young businessman named Feng rolled a suitcase into the lobby of a hotel in Wuzhou County, which is in central China. He was followed by a young woman named Yomi, who was also carrying some luggage. And as soon as they were in there, they both just sort of did a look around. And they saw the stained carpet and the outdated furniture, and they smelled a funky smell, and they both just sort of looked at each other. And it was obvious as they, exchanged this glance that they both were thinking the same thing. This hotel was a total dump. So Feng and Yomi were coworkers, and they were here on a week-long business trip. Feng had assumed they'd be staying somewhere nice, but clearly the company had other thoughts. They were probably trying to save money by putting them in this budget hotel in a crappy area. But Feng knew, realistically, the two of them couldn't really change this. This is what their company was putting them up in. It is what it is, So he and Yomi just kind of shrugged, and then they both headed over to the front desk to check in. A few moments later, after getting checked in, Feng and Yomi wheeled their suitcases into a tiny elevator. And as soon as they got inside, Feng noticed that Yomi was staring at her room key with a very worried expression. And Feng knew why. So the front desk clerk had given Yomi a room on the 4th floor. And in China, the number 4 is supposed to be very unlucky because the word 4 sounds like the word for death in the Chinese language. Now, Feng was not that superstitious, but he knew Yomi really was. I mean, to be given a room on the 4th floor was bad, But I mean, it went deeper than that for Yomi. I mean, this was a bad start, but I mean, Yomi was the type of person who, back home at their work building, she wouldn't even go to the end of hallways, like within their building. She would avoid the end of hallways because she believed that's where spirits would congregate. So she avoided the end of hallways, and she also avoided looking in mirrors or reflective surfaces because she believed that if you did that, your soul could be trapped inside of those alternate universes, inside of these reflective surfaces. And so he just knew this is like a big deal for her, and this was gonna probably totally disrupt this trip. So Feng, he looked at Yomi, and as gently as he could, he told her like, hey, don't worry about it. Like, don't freak yourself out. I'm sure it's fine. And Yomi, she nodded like she was agreeing with him, but she just kept staring at the room key like, this is not okay. She's telling him it's gonna be okay, but not to her. This is bad. Eventually, the elevator reached the 3rd floor and the doors opened up, and Feng got off because his room was on the 3rd floor. And he turned to Yomi, who again is still just staring at the room key, and he told her like, hey, I'm gonna get settled in and then I'll give you a call. Like, again, everything's gonna be fine, all right? And Yomi, she just nodded, but kept on staring at the room key, and Feng watched as the door shut, and she just continued up to the 4th floor. Less than 10 minutes later, when Feng was in his room, he was still putting his stuff away. He had not even had a chance to call Yomi yet. As he's getting settled in, basically, he sees his cell phone's ringing, and it's Yomi. So he's like, okay, picks it up, and he's like, hello. And she's totally frantic. And she says to him that she has to switch her room immediately. She said, not only was her room on the 4th floor, which was bad enough, but the room was at the end of the hallway. And then when she went inside of her room, which took a lot of courage, like she didn't even want to go in the room at all, but when she got in there, she said there were reflective surfaces and mirrors like everywhere. It was like she couldn't avoid looking at herself in these reflective surfaces. And she said on top of that, the air was just weirdly still, like it just felt awful in there. Like she couldn't be in there. This was a perfect storm of all of the things that scare her all in one, and she can't do it. She's got to change rooms. As Feng listened to this, he couldn't help but kind of roll his eyes. This just seemed like a little bit of an overreaction from Yomi. He got it. He understood why she was upset, but it's like, come on. But he wanted this trip to go well, and he did like Yomi. He wanted her to be happy because her mood affected him and this whole trip. And so he just told her, look, stay put, I'll take care of it. Then he left his room, he went down to the front desk, and after speaking to the front desk clerk, they swapped Yomi to a room on the 3rd floor. It was not at the end of the hall, it was in the middle of the hall. Perfect. And so Feng, he grabs this new room key, he goes up to the 4th floor, where he finds Yomi, who's standing in the middle of the hallway. She didn't put anything inside of her room, she's abandoned her room, and she's so relieved to see him. He gives her the new key, she's very thankful. Down to the 3rd floor they go. She heads off to her new room. She thanks him again. And Feng, he goes into his room thinking, okay, problem solved. As soon as she came down to breakfast, Feng immediately noticed that she seemed really, really low energy, like super lethargic or something. She grabbed her food, she sat down next to him, and she wasn't talking, and she was like barely eating her food. And she had this distant look in her eyes, and every time he'd speak to her, she really didn't engage with him. It's like she wasn't even hearing him, just giving him like one-word answers. She just felt totally off. And so Feng, like he was definitely worried about Yomi, but also selfishly, he was worried about himself. He's thinking, she seems like she could have picked up maybe like a travel bug, like maybe she's sick or something. And it really stressed him out because he really didn't want to get sick during this work trip. And so he just hoped that whatever was going on with her wasn't contagious. Around lunchtime, Feng and Yomi were joined by 3 other coworkers who would come in on a later flight. And one of them was actually their manager, a guy named Tsai. And so Tsai had the whole group meet up in his room so they could all go over the schedule for the rest of the week. But as soon as the whole group assembled in his room and the meeting began, everybody just wanted to complain about how terrible this hotel was and how silly it was that the company made them stay here. And in fact, one of them said, you know what, I'm just gonna check out and just go to a different hotel. Like, I can't be here. But Tsai shut that idea down right away, saying, you know what, that's way too expensive and way too time consuming, to move at this point. And then he just kind of shifted the whole conversation back to business. And he moved quickly through the entire meeting agenda for the week. And then when they were done, Yomi and the others left to go back to their own rooms. Well, they all left except for Feng. Feng stayed back to use Tsai's bathroom. So Tsai, he's outside in his room, and Feng, he's in the bathroom. And then when Feng was done, he came back out and he was about to leave when he looked into the room and he saw Tsai. And Tsai was sitting on the end of the bed, staring at the TV. And he had this weird look on his face, like a very troubled expression. And so Feng, he walks over to Tsai and he says, "Hey, are you okay?" And Tsai wouldn't tell him. Like, clearly something was wrong, but he wouldn't tell him. But eventually he would tell Feng, "I've changed my mind about this hotel. We need to leave this hotel immediately." A few hours later, the whole group checked out of the crappy hotel and moved their whole operation to a newer hotel downtown. And on their way to their new rooms, Feng, who was in great spirits about this change, made a comment to Yomi about how much better this place was. But Yomi just kind of ignored him and still acted like she could be sick or something and just wandered off to her own room, then shut the door behind her. The next morning, everyone met up for breakfast again, except for Yomi. She didn't show up. And so eventually Feng called up to her room, and when she picked up, she sounded really groggy. And then she said she definitely had a fever, like she was sick. And when Feng heard that, he's like, "Man, I sat next to her on the plane. I've eaten with her at every meal. I've been near her this whole time. If she's sick, I'm probably next." But he also felt totally normal right now, so he just hoped that whatever Yomi had, one, it wasn't too serious for her sake, but two, it wasn't that contagious. And over the next few days, Feng didn't get sick. So for him, he was thinking, great, I've been spared. But Yomi's situation, her fever, it only got worse. And she also started acting just really strange. She would lock herself inside of her room for hours at a time, refusing to eat or talk to anyone, which was obviously really bizarre on a business trip where the expectation is you're going to do a lot of eating and talking to people. And then on the rare occasions where she would come out of her room, Feng noticed that her eyes seemed like lifeless, like her mind was just somewhere else entirely. It was like she had this constant 1,000-yard stare going on. By Thursday, so 5 days into this trip, everybody was really worried about Yomi. Feng actually took her to see a doctor, and the doctor couldn't tell what was causing her fever, but he gave her antibiotics and then told her what she really needed was to leave this business trip and just go home and rest. And when their manager, Tsai, heard this recommendation from the doctor, he actually offered to buy Yomi a ticket to fly back home. But to all of their surprise, Yomi refused to leave. She just went back to her hotel room and locked the door behind her. 3 days later, on the evening of Sunday, March 24th, Feng stood in the hallway outside of Yomi's room as Tsai knocked on her door and shouted for Yomi to come out. The work trip was now over, and all 5 of them needed to leave for the airport to go back home, but Yomi was refusing to leave. She was not coming out. But finally, Feng and Tsai heard the sound of feet shuffling to the door inside of the hotel room. And even though Yomi didn't open the door, she called out to them in a very weak voice that they should just leave. Take your flight, go home. I'll catch my own flight in the morning. Feng was about to argue with her when Tsai raised his wrist and showed him his watch. And Feng realized that if they were going to catch their own flight, they had to leave right now. And so Tsai called back through the door that he'd book Yomi her own ride to the airport if she just sent him her new flight information. But for right now, they really had to go. Best of luck, but we gotta go. And so Feng, even though he felt pretty conflicted about what to do here, he ultimately decided that, they'd done everything they could. And he just followed his manager down to the car. And as they got in the car, Feng thought to himself, it's like Yomi, she's an adult. And if she thinks she's too sick to travel and she wants to fly home on her own the next day, that's her decision. But Yomi didn't find her own way home, because 2 days later, she was dead. That day, March 26th, Feng got a call from work with the news. The hotel staff had apparently found Yomi's body inside of her room when they went inside of there to clean it, but the exact condition of her body and cause of death were still unknown. When Feng heard this, he was devastated. He'd known that Yomi clearly was sick, but he'd never thought she was close to dying. And so now he was just overcome with grief at the loss of his friend, but also some level of guilt that maybe he could have done more to help her, and just confusion around this whole thing. Like what happened? Feng's best guess is that she must have caught some bug, and she very likely caught it on the first day when they were at that totally gross, unsanitary hotel. But Feng also knew that he very likely would never get a real answer. And so ultimately, Feng just tried to move on, and he kind of tried to bury his thoughts around the business trip because it was just so raw and he just didn't have any answers. And so he just thought it was best to push it over here and just go on with life. And that strategy pretty much worked until 2 years later, in November of 2021. That month, Feng met up with his manager, Tsai, who was on that fateful trip, for drinks. So immediately after that business trip, the whole group had been so traumatized that they really didn't discuss what happened much. They talked about the fact that obviously Yomi had died, but nobody got into details. It was too raw. But now that some time had passed, Tsai and Feng, they spent the whole time over drinks talking about Yomi and the trip. And Feng, he asked Tsai if he agreed that Yomi must have just caught her illness that killed her while staying at that first hotel. Do you think that's what it was? Just an unsanitary place, she got sick, she died. Do you think that's what happened? But to Feng's surprise, Tsai just shook his head and said, no, I don't think that's what happened. Then he asked Feng if he remembered that moment in the first hotel when Feng had come out of the bathroom and found Tsai sitting in front of the TV, acting sort of funny. And Feng's like, yeah, I asked you what was wrong and you wouldn't tell me. And then you said we need to switch hotels. I do remember that. I thought that was weird. And so Feng was confused by what his manager was asking him. Like, why are you asking about that moment? And he stared at Tsai, and Tsai looked back at him for a really long moment, just stared right at Feng. And then eventually he told Feng that he had it all backwards about Yomi. He said Yomi didn't catch something from that first hotel. The hotel caught Yomi. Tsai explained to Feng that while he was still in the bathroom, inside of the same room, Tsai said he turned on the TV. He was just watching TV for a moment. And then he saw something on the TV that was impossible. And it immediately indicated to him that something was terribly wrong with this hotel. He told Feng that he turned the TV on, and what he saw inside of the screen was Yomi. It was her face. It was like she was trapped inside of the reflective surface of the TV. And she had this look of absolute terror on her face, and she was looking out at Tsai like, you have to help me, I'm stuck. I'm trapped inside of here. And Tsai, he said he was so frightened that his first instinct was, I have to switch hotels. I need to save Yomi. But he said, Feng, when you came out and you asked me what was wrong, I didn't even know how to explain what was happening. I just knew that Yomi's life was at stake here. And so Tsai said to Feng that, we switched hotels, but it was already too late. Yomi's spirit was trapped inside of that first hotel. It had her spirit. And so her body went to the new hotel, but not with her spirit. And that's what killed her. Feng would eventually post this long account of this business trip on Chinese social media. And right away, lots of people read it and were really intrigued by it. And so internet sleuths who were taken with the story would actually locate court records from a lawsuit that was related to Yomi's death. But the lawsuit didn't really talk about, all the weird stuff that Feng detailed in his account. Really, it was just sort of matter of fact. And in fact, really all it said about her death was that it was classified as sudden death caused by various complications. So there really was not a whole lot more of meat on this story inside of the lawsuit. However, not long after Feng's story basically went viral on Chinese social media, like right as people were really trying to dig into this and see, what really happened to Yomi? Like, this is so weird. Was it, spirits? Was it the hotel? Like, what did it? What killed her? Around that same time, the Chinese government removed his post under Chinese content policies for spreading paranoia and fear. And so all that's left now from the story, at least from Feng's version of the story, are a few screenshots from people who read his account at the time and wanted to preserve it. One afternoon in the spring of 1948, a 12-year-old girl named Maggie sat by an open window in her kitchen at her home in a suburb of Charlotte, North Carolina. Maggie was trying to do her homework, but she couldn't focus because the entire neighborhood was way too quiet. Now, normally at this time of day, which is when Maggie typically did her homework, her neighbor would play his violin in his den, and the music always helped Maggie study. But for the past few weeks, her neighbor's house had been completely silent. And the reason for that was pretty tragic. So Maggie's neighbor was 19-year-old Kenneth Null, and he was like this unbelievably talented musician. As a young child, he had been like this violin prodigy. And now as a 19-year-old, he was like on another level with how good he was at playing that instrument. And so it was basically common knowledge that someday, probably soon, he was going to be famous. However, just a few weeks ago, Kenneth had been in a terrible car accident, and his right arm was completely mangled. Doctor said he would never use it again, which meant his violin career was over. Maggie knew that Kenneth was just completely devastated. His whole life had been built on playing the violin. It's like, what's he going to do now? And furthermore, Maggie herself had barely seen him leave the house since he got home from the hospital. It was like he was a shut-in. It was like his life was wrecked. And so for Maggie, as she sat there by the window, listening to the silence, she just couldn't take it anymore. She just really wanted to help Kenneth, even if it was something small, because he really had helped her a great deal over the many times she'd done her homework listening to his music. She wanted to return the favor. So she got up from the table and she walked over to the cupboard and she found a candy bar on the top shelf. And she decided she would go next door, she would give this to Kenneth, and it would cheer him up. A few minutes later, Maggie was standing on Kenneth's front porch, and she had her candy bar hidden behind her back, and with her other hand, she was knocking on the door. And a moment later, the door opened, and it was Kenneth. And immediately, Maggie could tell that, even though she knew Kenneth was probably not doing well, he looked awful. Like he was in really bad shape. His damaged arm, was in a sling across his chest, and his hair was greasy, and there were bags under his eyes like he hadn't been sleeping. To Maggie, it just seemed like Kenneth was extremely depressed, extremely sad. So she did the thing she came over here to do. She pulled the candy bar out from behind her back and she handed it to him. And she just said, "I hope you feel better." And Kenneth, despite looking so pained, he smiled and he looked genuinely touched by this gesture. And he actually reached out and he hugged Maggie with his good arm and he thanked her for coming over to see him. And then Maggie, maybe against her better judgment, she told Kenneth that she really missed him playing the violin after school each day. She said that his music was so beautiful. And to Maggie's surprise, Kenneth told her not to worry about it. He promised her that he would play the violin again, because if he didn't, he wouldn't want to live. One night, a few weeks later, around midnight, Maggie woke up in bed to the sound of violin music, and she gasped. Because immediately she recognized the melody and she knew that Kenneth was playing his violin again. And Maggie was so excited that even though it was the middle of the night, she climbed out of bed, she ran down the hallway and went out her front door. A minute later, Maggie was once again standing on Kenneth's front porch. And she knew that Kenneth and his mom often left the front door unlocked. And so Maggie, who's just so excited, she just reaches down and she tries the handle and it's unlocked. And so she opens the door up, she steps inside and, she had been listening to Kenneth's music this whole time, but it was sort of muffled because it's inside the house. Now she's in the entryway of the home and she can hear it. It's so much louder and it's so beautiful. And for a moment, she just stood there, listening to what in her mind was like the most beautiful music she had ever heard in her life. And so she stood there just listening to the music. And eventually she decides to just go into the den to go find Kenneth and actually listen to him play like right in front of her. She wanted to see it. She wanted to experience it again. And she wanted to congratulate him. And so into the den she goes. But the moment she steps through the threshold and she's in the den, the music stops. And the room is completely quiet. The house is eerily quiet. And she looks around like, did he see me? Is he nervous now that I'm here? She looks around and at first she doesn't even see him. Like he's not in the den. It's dark in the den. But then she looks at the couch and she screams. On the couch was Kenneth, and he was very clearly dead. His body was stiff, and in his hands he was clutching his violin. A doctor would later determine that Kenneth had died of a cerebral hemorrhage, a full 2 hours before Maggie first heard that music. On the morning of March 27, 1907, a 45-year-old woman named Mary Watson was cleaning her parlor in the small town of Wadesville, Indiana. She was standing on a step stool, and she was using a broom to sweep the cobwebs and the dust off the ceiling, and as she was doing that, she began to feel lightheaded. So immediately, she put the broom down and she climbed off the step stool, and she thought, she hadn't really had much to eat that morning, and so that must be why she was feeling dizzy. And so while she stood on the flat ground, waiting for this to pass, she reached over and she grabbed a biscuit and some coffee from the tray that her husband Zach had left for her before he had left for work that morning. Now, she didn't plan to rest here for too long, basically just until the dizziness cleared, and then she would get back to work because she had a lot of work still to do. She really wanted to have the house clean before Zach got back home. So Mary and Zach had only recently gotten married, just 5 months ago. And so they were still very much in the honeymoon phase of their relationship, where basically, everything was so great. They loved each other so much. Mary felt like she'd landed the perfect man. Zach was smart, he was charming, and he had a good job running the local post office. And most of the time, he was pretty upbeat and had a good sense of humor. However, just a few weeks ago, right around the beginning of March, that had changed. Zach had suddenly become really moody and quite distant. And when he got home from work, instead of chatting with Mary like he used to, he would go straight to his study and just sit alone for hours. But Mary didn't have to ask him what was bothering him because she knew. She knew that this time of the year was really hard for her husband because he had actually been married previously, twice actually, and both of his previous wives had died in March. And in fact, they died just 1 year apart from each other. So this month was just like a very tragic time for him. And these deaths were not like in the distant past. They were kind of recent. His first wife had died 2 years ago in March of 1905, and then his second wife had followed in March of 1906. So almost exactly 1 year ago to today's date, March of 1907. Now, Mary did think this was tragic, a horrible coincidence, But Mary's sisters, they found this pattern to be very suspicious, and they'd even tried to talk Mary out of going through with the wedding, asking if she really wanted to marry a man whose wives kept dropping dead. But Mary had brushed off their concerns because really deep down, she trusted him. She knew ultimately he really was a victim here of just terrible, unlucky coincidence. Now, the coroner had officially ruled that both of Zach's wives had died of sudden illnesses. And to some degree, to Mary's sisters, that only added to the suspicion. But to Mary, it seemed like it just sort of got rid of the suspicion of anything. How could Zach have had anything to do with his wives suddenly getting sick? It just didn't make any sense to her. However, despite firmly standing behind her husband here, what Mary did struggle with when it came to her husband's previous wives and this whole thing was that Zach clearly was still grieving his other wives. Like they were clearly on his mind, as they should be, and she understood that, but that was tough. But Mary had nowhere to put these feelings. She couldn't be mad at him. His first wife, Sarah, they had been together for 34 years before she died. That is a whole life before Mary, and she knew that. And then, the second wife, it is what it is. It was a short marriage, but she couldn't blame him for the situation she was in. It was just difficult. But sometimes, despite logically understanding the situation that she was in and doing her best to sort of emotionally contain it, Mary sometimes got this feeling that it was almost like she was living in somebody else's house, or like she was living in somebody else's life, specifically Sarah's life. Sarah was Zach's first wife. They had been together for those 34 years. Ever since Mary had moved into this home with Zach, which is where Sarah had lived for all those years, Mary had been hesitant to do anything, to rearrange furniture or change the ugly green wallpaper that she really wanted to change in the parlor here, or get rid of any of the old-fashioned decor. It's like she knew that, that would be sort of bad for Zach potentially, that he would see that as, disrespectful to his first wife and to some degree his second wife. Mary just sort of felt like she was the third wheel in a sense. But as Mary stood in that parlor with the ugly green wallpaper, waiting for her headache and her dizziness to clear from when she had been cleaning the ceiling here, she's having those thoughts about how difficult her life was, but she reminded herself that, despite it all, she was Zach's wife now. No matter how she felt about it, those were the facts. She was his wife and he was her husband. And so no matter how she felt about this house, the house was primarily her responsibility. And she was going to make sure that it was clean. So after taking a final sip of coffee, Mary grabbed her broom and she was about to climb back up on the stepladder to get back to cleaning the ceiling when she was hit with another really intense wave of nausea. She had to grab a table just to steady herself, and as she does, she feels this really intense, sharp cramp in her stomach that caused her to double over, and then before long, she collapsed to the ground right onto her knees, just writhing in pain. A few hours later, Mary's sister, Nancy, was standing outside of Mary and Zach's house, just absolutely breaking down, crying, just totally upset. And as she did this, she was watching as the undertaker loaded Mary's body into a horse-drawn wagon. Nancy couldn't believe how quickly this had all happened. I mean, she and Mary talked all the time. And that morning, Mary had sent a young neighbor over to Nancy's place to tell her that Mary said she was feeling sick and needed some help. But by the time Nancy arrived, it was too late. Mary was vomiting and she was convulsing. And by around 1 p.m., she was dead. And this was exactly what Nancy had feared would happen when Mary and Zach got married. She just hadn't imagined that it could possibly happen so quickly. So now, as the undertaker drove off with her sister's body inside, Nancy's gaze shifted to Zach, who was over on the porch talking to the town doctor. Zach had now lost 3 wives in 3 years, all in the same month too, like exactly a year apart. And Nancy, at this point, she was sure that he had to be responsible. Like, how else could this ever be possible unless he was doing something to these women? And Nancy, she was determined to prove it. The next day, Nancy and the rest of Mary's family walked with the town doctor and with Zach through Zach and Mary's home, looking for clues about what could have killed Mary. And all of them were just peppering Zach with questions about what each of his wives had been doing right before they died. And so far, Nancy wasn't hearing anything that made her think that Zach was innocent. According to Zach, there was 0 connection between the 3 deaths, except for the fact that they all happened in March. One of the wives had eaten a full breakfast before she died, and one had eaten nothing before she died. And Mary had actually only had some coffee and apparently a couple of bites of biscuits before she died. Zach also said that his first and second wives had been complaining of feeling sick for about 2 days before they ultimately succumbed and died. But Mary had been basically perfectly fine right up until she just suddenly died. Now, to Nancy, it seemed like Zach was trying way too hard to make it all just seem sort of random. She just didn't believe that there was literally no connection between all 3 deaths. How could that be? This is way too coincidental. And so Nancy was very happy to see that the town doctor was systematically gathering up different things from inside the house as they walked around, like silverware and various food items, basically anything that Mary might have put in her mouth or maybe touched, because he planned to get them all tested to see if maybe there was poison involved here. And so Nancy was glad that, Zach's saying one thing, but we're gonna actually test some stuff and see if that's really true. And so Nancy began following the doctor as he was scooping up all these different things, and eventually they found their way into the parlor, which is where Mary ultimately died. And when they were in the parlor, the doctor just abruptly stopped, and then he pointed to something in the middle of the room. And then he turned and looked at Nancy and the rest of the group who were also coming in, and he just said, "I know what happened." And Nancy was so caught off guard by this. She figured this was going to take some time to figure out this mystery. She looked past the doctor into the parlor to where he had been pointing, and she expected to see some kind of obvious clue, but to her confusion, there was just a step stool and then a dusty old broom. That was all he pointed to, and she couldn't understand what he was talking about. So it would turn out that the 3 wives actually did have something in common when it came to their untimely deaths. So in the early 1900s, the month of March was the time for spring cleaning. And spring cleaning was what all of Zach's wives had been doing right before they died. Specifically, all of them had been cleaning the parlor, which had that ugly green wallpaper in it. But this wallpaper was not just ugly. It also contained a toxic substance known as arsenic. And when Mary and both of Zach's other wives dusted with the broom, it kicked up a cloud of deadly particles that they all inhaled. And so the town doctor had the wallpaper tested, and he would confirm that all 3 women had died of poisoning. Except the culprit was not Zach, it was the wallpaper. A few weeks later, Zach would have that wallpaper torn down, and then he married a 4th wife, but this time she outlived him. Minimum payments are not designed to get people out of debt. They're designed to keep them stuck. That's why so many people are turning to PDS debt for a real solution. PDS debt can reduce up to half of what's owed on credit cards, personal loans, and even medical bills. The process starts with a free 30-second assessment at pdsdebt.com/Mrballen. PDS uses AI and data to go beyond the numbers and personalize saving solutions for each person's situation. Instead of juggling multiple payments every month, PDS debt can help combine them into one lower monthly payment, and savings can start the same day the 30-second assessment is completed. If there's a balance sitting on credit cards right now, interest charges are adding up every single day. PDS debt offers a way to finally take control, and there's no minimum credit score required. PDS debt is one of the top-rated companies in the industry, with thousands of 5-star reviews and an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau. Get your free 30-second personalized assessment today at pdsdebt.com/Mrballen. One morning in the spring of 1885, a young man named Henry Ziegland was leading a horse around his family's farm in Driner Township, Minnesota. The horse was recovering from a minor hoof injury, and now Henry was taking it for a walk to give it some light exercise and get a sense of how it was actually doing. And Henry was in an unusually good mood. He was enjoying the warm breeze, and he also just had this great feeling that he had his whole life ahead of him, which was really not a feeling that Henry was used to at all. So until recently, Henry had been engaged to a young woman named Maisie Tickner. Henry had started talking to her 5 years ago when they were both in their early 20s, and their initial romance had been great. They'd fallen for each other really quickly, and they'd actually moved in together really quickly, even though back then that kind of thing was definitely frowned upon unless you were married, but they're like, don't worry, we're gonna get married, it's okay. And so people were like, I don't know, but they were like, it doesn't matter. We're gonna get married, it's all gonna be good. Except the wedding had never really materialized. Now, Henry hadn't planned to break his promise to Maisie, but first he'd just been busy with his farming. And then Maisie had taken a new teaching job. And since they were already living together, Henry hadn't seen what the difference would be if they got married anyways. It just sort of seemed like, what's the big rush? But as the years went by and they continued not to get married, Maisie began pestering Henry more and more about just setting a date so they could finally get married and stop living this sort of scandalous life. And for Henry, he understood why she was doing this, but the more she asked, the more he sort of began to think, wait a minute, I don't know if I want to marry her. I don't know if this is a good idea at all for me. And then finally, just a few days ago, Maisie had sat Henry down in their kitchen and had given him an ultimatum. He could either marry her like he had promised, or they were done. And in that moment, Henry had sort of realized that ending this relationship was exactly what he wanted. So that day, he was like, okay, I guess we're done. He packed his things, and he moved into his family's farm. And Maisie had been sort of caught off guard by this, because as much as she's the one positioning the ultimatum, acting like she's prepared to walk away too, in reality, she wasn't. She really wanted to get married. That's what she wanted. She was just trying to force him to finally do it. And so when he was like, okay, bye, we're over, it's like she tried to stop him, but then she began saying like, you're ruining my life. Like, you're ruining my life, not your life, my life. So a broken engagement after having lived together and shared the same bed for years at a time and then never getting married, that was a very bad situation for both parties, but at the time, it was far worse, socially, let's say, for the woman than it was for the man. And so in Maisie's mind, and I'm sure Henry understood this too, but for Maisie, it's sort of like, Henry, if you walk out on me right now, no one's gonna want me. Like, my life will be ruined, and yours won't be. Like, you're the guy. You're gonna be able to go on and get married, and I won't be able to. But Henry didn't really care, and he left. And now, after a few days since the separation, Henry, despite logically knowing that he clearly had put Maisie in a very bad position, he knew that, but he knew internally as well, he had made the right decision. Because right now, he felt great. He felt free for the first time in a long time. And so he did what he had to do. And so Henry finished his laps with the horse, and then he walked it over to the watering trough, which was underneath this big oak tree near the barn. And he had just tied the horse to that oak tree to let it drink when he heard someone shouting his name. Henry spun around, and he saw a man stalking toward him from across the field. And the man was Maisie's older brother, Filford. And his face was bright red, and he was glaring at Henry like he meant to kill him here. Which Henry realized was a very real possibility, considering what Henry had just done to Filford's sister. And then on top of that, as Henry's sort of taking this all in, he sees that Filford doesn't just look mad. He's also carrying a rifle, this old-fashioned rifle. And when Henry saw the gun, he immediately panicked and he turned to run away, but the huge oak tree was in his way. He sort of bounced off the tree and he turned back around. And by this point, Filford had closed the distance, and there was clearly nowhere where Henry could reasonably run without still clearly being in range of Filford's weapon. And so Henry, not knowing what else to do, just dropped to his knees and threw his hands up and begged Filford for mercy, telling him, you don't understand, we had to break up. I would never want to hurt Maisie on purpose. You got to believe me. She wouldn't want you to do this. You got to spare me. She loved me. Let it go. And for a moment, Henry felt like maybe he'd gotten through to Filford and he wasn't going to get shot here. Filford, who by this point was only a few feet away from Henry, he was still gripping his gun, just glaring at Henry. And there was this moment of just really intense silence. And then he said something that made Henry's stomach drop. He told him that he would have no way of knowing what Maisie would have wanted to do here with Henry, because earlier that very morning, his sister had taken her own life. And then Filford, he raised his rifle and he fired. Pain immediately exploded in Henry's head, and he felt himself get literally thrown backwards really hard. And he bounced off the oak tree and fell to the ground, expecting at any point for everything to just go black forever, to just die and be done with it. But after a few seconds, he realized he wasn't dead. His head was pounding from where he had just been shot, and he could feel blood running into his eyes and all over his whole body. So clearly he knows he's been shot, but somehow he's still conscious. And then he heard the sound of Filford reloading his rifle. Henry considered trying to get up and making a run for it, but it was what chance did he really stand here? He's already been shot once. The guy's clearly willing to shoot him. He's reloading. He's right in front of him. How far can he possibly get before he gets shot again? So instead, he just lay still and prayed that maybe Filford would think he was dead and not shoot him again. And so Henry's heart hammered in his chest as he listened to the sounds, the mechanical sounds of Filford reloading this rifle. And this was a painfully slow process because Filford's gun was an old army musket from the Civil War. So he's packing gunpowder and a lead pellet into the barrel of this gun. This is a lengthy reloading process. And this whole time, Henry, as he's listening to this, he's just holding his breath, trying to be still. But at the same time, he's getting more and more certain that he was about to die. There was no way he was not about to get shot again. What else could Filford be doing? Finally, Henry heard the metal click of the gun cocking, which meant that it was now loaded. And so Henry, trying his best still not to move, he still tensed up a little bit, bracing for the impact. And then there was this deafening bang, just like the first one. As soon as he heard it, Henry flinched, but he didn't feel anything. Instead, he just heard a thump and then silence. He waited a few more seconds, and then he opened one eye, and Filford was lying a few feet away, bleeding profusely from what appeared to be a self-inflicted gunshot to his head. Despite being shot in the head, Henry would survive this attempt on his life, and Filford would die from the self-inflicted gunshot wound. Now, Henry did understand that, by breaking up with Maisie, It had very likely led to her taking her life, and it almost got him killed, and it definitely led to Filford taking his life. Like, there's a lot of death and tragedy here because of something that, Henry largely did, but he didn't feel any guilt after he ultimately survived this attempt on his life. The way he rationalized it was he thought that Maisie and Filford were just both very weak. I mean, Maisie, instead of trying to move on and rebuild like a strong person, she had been weak and she had taken the easy way out. And Filford, he had one shot, point blank. He could have shot and killed Henry and gotten his justice, but he missed, and then he took the easy way out. He took his own life instead of facing consequences. And so Henry just felt like, screw those people. And after that day that he was attacked by Filford, it was like his luck just seemed to get better and better. His head wound really had been superficial and it healed quickly. And soon after he was fully recovered, he married a wealthy widow. And with her money, his farm grew, and he eventually became one of the richest men in the whole area. And as the years went by, his thoughts about Maisie and Filford just kind of faded into the background, until everything that happened just sort of felt like a distant memory from an entirely different life. That is, until 20 years later, on March 21st, 1905. On this morning, Henry was cutting down some old dying trees on his property with his teenage son. Now, at this point, Henry had plenty of farmhands, so he didn't have to do this kind of job himself. But he liked showing his son how things were done, so this was like a teaching moment. Now, so far that day, they'd been working their way through some of these smaller trees that needed to get removed. But the last one, the big oak tree near the barn, had wood that was so hard that their saws could not cut through it. So Henry explained to his son what you do in this type of situation, which is you get some dynamite and you literally blow the tree up. And Henry had some dynamite just for this occasion, and he grabbed it and he walked over to this oak tree and he jammed it inside of the hollow of the trunk. He told his son to get back, and then he lit the fuse, and then he hustled back with his son, and they hid behind shelter, and they watched and they waited. And after a few seconds, the fuse burned all the way into the dynamite, and then it exploded. 20 years earlier, when Henry was shot in the head by Filford and narrowly survived, well, that bullet that hit him, it literally ricocheted off his skull and lodged in the oak tree right behind him. Like, it just basically bounced off his head. And that bullet remained lodged in that oak tree for the 20 years after. And then comes the day that Henry decides he wants to take this tree down and he can't cut it down. So what does he do? He puts dynamite inside and he decides he's going to blow it up. And after lighting the fuse, he and his son, they go all the way 50 feet away, thinking they're well out of harm's way here for when this thing detonates. Except they weren't. When that dynamite exploded, the force of the explosion basically rocketed that bullet that was still lodged in the tree right back at Henry. It hit him square in the head, and this time it penetrated and it killed him instantly. So, in essence, Filford didn't miss. It just took 20 years for the bullet he fired to kill Henry. On the evening of November 22nd, 2018, a middle-aged woman named Mandy was sitting in her living room at her home in a coastal town in southern England, reading a book while the TV played as background noise. And as she was sitting there, she heard the distinctive sound of footsteps kind of shuffling down the stairs. And Mandy looked up and she watched as her wife, Lena, came stumbling down the stairs, and in her hand was her favorite cup, which was a mason jar with a metal straw in it. And Mandy watched as Lena stumbled her way into the living room and then began, stumbling over towards the kitchen. And as she did this, Mandy just kind of cringed, because Mandy knew what Lena was about to do. And sure enough, just a moment later, when Lena had made her way into the kitchen, sort of out of sight, Mandy heard the sound of the refrigerator door opening up, and then the distinctive sound of liquid being poured into a cup, as Lena made herself another cocktail of vodka and orange juice. So Mandy had married Lena 4 years ago, and for that entire time, Lena had been a drinker. But Mandy always tried hard not to harp too much on Lena for drinking too much, because she knew that Lena really only drank alcohol to help manage her overwhelming back pain. So about 40 years earlier, when Lena was much younger, she had been a competitive horse jockey and racehorse trainer. But when she was 21 years old, she had suffered this awful horse riding accident that had permanently damaged her spine. She had developed scoliosis and had been in constant pain from this injury ever since. And sometimes the pain would get so bad that Lena would literally just collapse to the ground and couldn't do anything. But alcohol numbed the pain a little bit. And sometimes the pain would get so bad that Lena would literally just collapse to the ground and just lay there writhing in pain. I mean, this was like a very serious amount of discomfort. Now, at first, Lena's doctors had been prescribing her fentanyl, a very powerful pain medication, to help manage her pain. But Lena began showing signs of becoming addicted to fentanyl. And so before that could really happen, doctors had stepped in and weaned her off of the fentanyl. But Lena, at this point, she didn't want to become addicted to pills either, but she also still had this pain, and without the fentanyl, there was no pain numbing happening. And so Lena had begun self-medicating by drinking about half a liter of vodka every single day. And she would mix the vodka, often with orange juice, and she would carry it around the house in her mason jar with that metal straw. And so anytime Mandy saw her with that, she knew what she was doing. Now, Mandy knew that Lena's drinking was obviously an issue. I mean, they replaced addiction, for pills with alcohol addiction. But at the same time, Mandy just felt like, I can't really get in the way of this. She's in so much pain. What can really be done here? So after hearing the sound of Lena getting another drink, Mandy just went back to reading her book on the couch. But as she was reading, with the TV playing in the background and the sound of Lena sort of doing whatever she was doing in the kitchen, there was suddenly this really weird noise that actually pulled Mandy out of her book. It almost sounded like a gurgling sound that was coming from the kitchen. So Mandy got up to go see what was going on. When Mandy walked into the kitchen, she saw Lena was on the ground. She was laid out flat on the floor, still holding her mason jar. But Mandy didn't panic. I mean, Lena's falls were just a fact of life, and all Mandy needed to do now was just help Lena back up again. But when Mandy bent down to do that, she got a look at Lena's face. And in one terrible moment, she instantly understood what that gurgling noise was and what had happened to Lena. And so Mandy, she lunged for her phone and she called the police. It would turn out that night, Lena actually was not drunk. She was walking around with her favorite drinking cup, but she was actually going into the kitchen to get more water. She was just thirsty. The reason she was hobbling all around, sort of acting drunk, if you weren't looking closely, is just because of her back pain. That's what was causing her to stumble around. But in the kitchen, after filling up her mason jar with water, she stumbled and fell like she would when she was drunk. But again, this time it's just from pain. And she fell onto her mason jar. Specifically, her eye socket landed on that upturned metal straw, and it impaled her skull, punctured her brain, and caused a traumatic brain injury. The sound of her gurgling was because of that traumatic brain injury, which would ultimately kill her. On the evening of November 2nd, 1888, a 45-year-old man named Hipólito Hoyos got dressed in a three-piece suit in the bedroom of his very cramped apartment in Paris, France. In the next room, he could hear his wife, Alphonsine, cooking dinner, while their three young kids ran around playing. And even though this really should have felt like a happy, idyllic moment, Hipólito instead felt this pang of worry, because keeping this family afloat was his responsibility. And recently, he'd had a very hard time doing that. So Hipólito had grown up on a farm in Belgium, and when he was younger, he'd gotten into some trouble with the law and basically had a really tough time kind of finding his way in life. But about 10 years ago, he had moved to France and he had met Alphonsine, and he also found a steady job running a farm for a wealthy French noble in the countryside. Now, Hipólito knew a lot about agriculture. He'd grown up on a farm. So in theory, this job really should have been perfect for him. But the problem was, no one on the farm really liked him. And it was true, he'd been very strict with the farmhands. But a lot of them had taken that sternness and they had gone to their boss and complained about him. saying that he was overbearing and very difficult to work with. So last month, when Ippolita's contract was up and he was expecting his boss would renew it, his boss didn't. And so now Ippolita's, perfect life, this amazing life he had built for himself here in France with Alphonsine, felt like it was falling apart. And so following not getting his contract renewed, Ippolita and his wife and their kids had moved to Paris so he could look for other work. But luckily, they'd also found this very cheap, but luckily furnished apartment just the week before, so they at least had a place to live, but Ippolita still needed work. Now, this new neighborhood they were in, understandably, because it was so cheap, it was largely full of, working class people. And there were lots of factories and lots of warehouses, so it was sort of a little bit rough and tumble compared to what Ippolita had become accustomed to, working for this nobleman out in the countryside. I mean, Ippolita, he wasn't crazy about the area. He had expensive tastes, even though he didn't have an expensive budget. However, Ippolita knew that this whole situation was just temporary, because after all, he was about to come into a huge windfall. And he actually had to travel outside of Paris right now to actually get the money, which was what he was currently getting dressed for. And so on this trip, his friend, 52-year-old Louis Baron, would be accompanying him, at least for a portion of the trip, because he was going the same way for a job interview that Ippolita had actually helped set up for him. Now, Louis was also from Belgium, and so he had known Ippolita for a long time, but things were tense between them at the moment. Ippolita had arranged for Louis to work on the farm that he used to manage, but when Ippolita was fired, it had also cost Louis his job there as well. The reality was, Louis was quite furious. I mean, he was really upset about it, to the point where Ippolita had actually helped pay for a room at a hotel just a few blocks away from his apartment in Paris for Louis. And he'd even let Louis borrow one of his suits to wear to this job interview. And so really, Ippolita was hopeful that by the end of this trip he was going on, his buddy Louis would finally just stop being mad at him. That was causing lots of problems. So now, after getting dressed in his fancy suit, Ippolita packed up a bag with some extra clothes and some cash, and he put on a hat. Then he went into the kitchen to kiss Alphonsine goodbye. She kissed him back, but she definitely seemed a little bit anxious, and Ippolita figured she was just thinking about being left alone with their 3 small kids. So he just reassured her that, this trip, this was all going to be worth it. Like, don't worry about a thing. I'll be back soon. Then he said goodbye to the kids and then left for the train station. Just after dark that night, Ippolita stepped off a train at the station in Chantilly, which is about 30 miles north of Paris. Louis was with him and already dressed for his interview in the suit that Ippolita had given him. And as the 2 men walked across the platform, Ippolita noticed that Louis was moving sort of slowly and awkwardly, like he was uncomfortable in the suit, like he wasn't used to dressing that way. The men left the station on foot and continued walking down the road towards Senlis, the little town where they were both spending the night. It was about a 6-mile walk to get there, and once they got outside of Chantilly, the road was surrounded almost entirely by woods. It was dark and it was late, so there weren't many people that were out and about, and the 2 men didn't talk much, so the walk was very quiet. Eventually, as they were approaching Senlis, they came to this narrow stone bridge with metal railings on either side that passed over a railroad track. And as they reached it, Ippolita heard this rustling in the trees. He stopped and he listened, and as he did, he felt his heart start to pound because this whole walk has been just like eerily quiet. And so to hear anything was just sort of alarming. But as he stood there listening, he couldn't hear it anymore, so he decided he must be imagining things. Now, Louis did not appear to hear the sounds at all, and he was still walking ahead across the bridge. So Ippolita, he took a deep breath and then hurried onto the bridge to catch up with him. The next morning, 2 road maintenance workers were hauling a gravel-filled cart down that same wooded road that connected Chantilly and Senlis, the road that Louis and Ippolita had been on the night before. And so these workers were looking for potholes that they would fill in with this gravel. And so they're moving along, they're filling in potholes, and then eventually they got to that narrow bridge by Senlis. And when they did, one of them noticed a man's hat lying near the bridge's railing. And as they got near the hat, they looked on the pavement and saw these dark splatters of blood. Now, the workers were immediately on edge. They're looking around, they don't see anybody. But at some point, one of them looked over the railing. And when he saw what was down below, he immediately shouted that they had to go tell the police. Later that morning, a judge named Jean Auberton walked down a small hill by some railroad tracks. At the bottom, a police officer and 2 road maintenance workers stood next to the tracks, staring down at a dead body. So, in France at the time, judges were responsible for leading investigations instead of police. So Auberton would essentially function as the lead detective on this case. And all he'd been told so far was that a body had been found on this stretch of train tracks, and he really didn't know what to expect beyond that. When Auberton reached the group down below, the police officer explained that the 2 workers, the road maintenance workers, had found the body that morning. They'd flagged down a train conductor who had stopped just in time and then waited for them to move the body off the tracks, and then the conductor kept going in his train and notified the police at the next station. And so Auberton, he knelt down to get a better look at the body. And, right away he could tell that it was clearly a man with blonde hair and that he was wearing a nice 3-piece suit. But that was really about all he could conclude, because his face was just completely mangled and his head was almost completely severed from his body. Many of his teeth were also broken, and there was also a deep gash on his left foot near his ankle. Now, at first glance, Auberton wondered if he had just jumped off the bridge and got hit by a train. But when he looked closer, the pattern of the wounds on his face just did not look like they'd been caused by a train. These were long, distinct gashes going in multiple different directions. It looked more like this man had been attacked with a sharp weapon, like an axe or something. And Auberton's best guess was that whatever happened to this guy very likely happened the night before. There wasn't much decomposition, and this railroad line got a lot of traffic. So the body couldn't have been here for very long, or another train conductor would have seen him earlier, or maybe wouldn't have seen him and then run him over, and then, his body would be completely mangled. As Auberton stood up, one of the workers told him that they had seen blood up on the bridge. So Auberton, he climbed up the small hill onto the bridge, and he saw that hat that was lying by the railing, and then just a ton of blood all around the hat on the ground. And to Auberton, there was so much blood up here that he figured his theory that this guy was attacked had to have been right here. He very likely was attacked right here on the bridge. And he either fell over the edge during the assault, or maybe after the assault, his killer threw his body, maybe to make it look like a suicide, or perhaps to dispose of evidence. And so at this point, Auberton felt pretty much certain that this was a homicide, and he knew he would have to identify this victim as soon as possible. Mrballen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories is brought to you by FanDuel. Baseball fans, think you know who's hitting a homer today? Well, FanDuel is giving you a free chance to call your shot with Daily Dingers. Before I make my Daily Dingers picks, I take a minute to look over the day's matchups and see who's been swinging a hot bat, who's got a favorable pitching matchup, things like that. It's a quick, fun part of my baseball routine. Joining the action is easy. Just make your free pick on who's hitting a home run in their game, and if you're right, you'll get a profit boost to use on your next bet for a chance at extra winnings. You've got nothing to lose and a lot to gain. And don't forget, you can make a free pick every day during the MLB season. It's just another reason why FanDuel is the home for home runs. So, are you ready to play your game today? Join all the action at FanDuel.com. That's FanDuel.com to play Daily Dingers and make your free pick on who's hitting a homer. Play ball and swing for the fences on FanDuel, an official partner of the MLB. On the afternoon of November 4th, 1888, the day after a man's body was found mangled in the woods near Senlis, France, Judge Auberton walked down a busy street in a working-class part of Paris. Now, by this point, he'd already gotten the autopsy results back, but they didn't really tell him much that he didn't already know, which was that the victim had been killed by multiple strikes from a sharp weapon, like a hatchet. Now, even though the body itself had not given Auberton too much to go on for this investigation, the clothes that the victim had on had given him something. Auberton had spent the past day piecing together clues that he had found in the victim's pockets, including a piece of paper with an address to a location in Paris and the initials HH embroidered on a handkerchief. And at this point, Auberton knew what HH meant. It was the initials for the victim, Hippolyte Hoyos. Overton had gone to that address in Paris from that piece of paper, and he found it belonged to an acquaintance of Hippolyta's. And this person had not only identified Hippolyta, but also he gave Overton Hippolyta's last known address, where he had lived with his family. And Overton was right outside of that address now. But as he looked up at the building that matched the address he'd been given, he wondered if he had the wrong place. The man whose body had been found was wearing this really nice suit, and looked like he was upper class, based on the suit. And this was definitely not an upper class place to live. This was not a nice area. But Overton went inside anyways, and he walked up a flight of stairs, and then he knocked on the door of the apartment number that he'd been given. Seconds later, a very tired-looking woman answered the door, bouncing a toddler on her hip, and Overton asked her if this was the home of Hippolyta Hoyos. And the woman just kind of frowned and said yes, she was actually his wife, Alphonsine. Overton kept it simple and just said that he was a judge and he was conducting an investigation, and asked if he could come in. Alphonsine got this uneasy look on her face, but she nodded and said come on in. Once they'd both sat down at the dining room table, Overton told her that the investigation he was doing was for a homicide, that a body had been found in the woods near Senlis, France, and he believed, unfortunately, the body belonged to her husband, Hippolyta. And to Overton's surprise, Alphonsine just didn't seem very upset at all. She just sat there expressionless, as Overton went on to explain a little bit further, what actually happened, that, the body had been found on some train tracks, and it appeared like that he had been attacked. Someone had clearly killed him. And as Overton did this, he kept waiting for Alphonsine to cry or gasp or really show any emotion, but she just didn't. And Overton couldn't decide whether this was suspicious or if, this woman was just in shock. So after, laying out why he was here, he began just asking her questions to get a better read on her. So he asked her, when was the last time you saw your husband? And she just began to speak. She said it was the evening he had left for the train station. He was going to Belgium to collect the inheritance from a relative who had died recently. She said that she'd been staying home and taking care of their 3 kids since then and hadn't heard anything from him since he had left. To Overton, this explained why Hippolyta was found in Senlis, because Senlis was about halfway between Paris and Belgium, so clearly he was on his way to Belgium. However, as he was internalizing this new information, he was interrupted by a very loud gasp. And he looked at Alphonsine to see that she had sort of broken out of her muted state and was staring at him with really wide eyes, like something huge had just occurred to her. And she told him, maybe her husband had been on his way back with all the money he got from the inheritance. And she said, maybe he was killed by a robber. Now, Overton, he considered this, and a robbery did make sense to him. Hippolyta was very well dressed, and there hadn't been any money in any of his pockets. But this whole interview with his wife just felt really off. Alphonsine didn't seem at all confused or rattled or upset in any way. And now, just literally moments after finding out that potentially your husband has been brutally murdered, like he's dead, she's begun pitching theories of how he was killed, like she was trying to point the finger at someone else right away. It just felt off. Now, to Overton, Alphonsine did not really seem like she could have been the one to actually kill Hippolyta herself. She's clearly here alone with 3 young kids, and this took place in Senlis, and more than that is Hippolyta was a pretty big guy, and he clearly had been overpowered by somebody or maybe multiple people, and Alphonsine was quite small. However, if she was involved and maybe hired someone to carry out a hit on her husband, well, that would cost presumably quite a bit of money, and considering, the low quality nature of where they lived, it just seemed unlikely to Overton that she would be able to afford paying a hitman. And so at this point, Overton didn't think that Alphonsine was a particularly strong suspect, but at the same time, he couldn't completely rule her out. However, one thing he was definitely sure about, just based on a gut feeling here, was that Alphonsine knew something more than she was telling him. That night, when Judge Overton got back to the courthouse in Senlis, he walked down the hallway toward his office and saw a police officer waiting at his door. And this officer told him that they'd arrested a man that afternoon whose name was Etienne Bouillot for the murder of Hippolyta Hoyos. Overton's heart began to race, and when he heard Etienne was in a holding cell in the jail right next door, he told the officer to take him there right away. As they hurried down the hallway and out of the courthouse, the officer explained to Overton that a group of police had been out at the crime scene near Senlis collecting evidence, and at some point they'd passed Etienne sitting in the woods nearby. And as soon as he saw the police approaching, Etienne had just started running. And so the officers had chased him down and they had caught him, and when they did, they noticed he had blood on his pants and on his jacket. They also found a bloody handkerchief that was in one of his pockets. Now, the officer said that Etienne had claimed he was hit by a cart the night before, and that was why he was covered in so much blood. But the police were just not convinced, especially because Etienne refused to give them an alibi for where he had been the night Hippolyta was actually killed. And so the officer and Overton, they get to the jail and they go inside, and when they reach the holding cell, Overton saw Etienne sitting inside, and he was wearing very shabby clothes and looked like he might be homeless. And so Overton, he goes inside the cell, and Etienne, he's just sitting there, he's not saying anything, and Overton, he just sits down and begins going over all the evidence that they had. And a lot of it made it seem like Etienne was their guy. And at some point, when Overton was done sort of going over what they had, he told Etienne that, "You're basically our only suspect at this point." So unless he could give Overton an alibi for the night of November 2nd, the night that Hippolyta was killed, then unfortunately, Etienne was very likely going to be charged with murder. At this point, Etienne just sort of looked down for a moment and then let out this long, defeated sigh, like the reality of his situation was really settling in. Eventually, he looked back up at Overton and he mumbled that he did have an alibi. He said he had spent the whole night sleeping at an inn in Chantilly. He said the reason he hadn't told the police this is because he actually left the inn without paying. And that's also why he had run from the police when he was seen in the woods. He thought they were there to arrest him for theft. Overton looked hard at Etienne. He wasn't sure if he believed him, but he wrote down the name of the inn and planned to go out there and verify Etienne's alibi first thing in the morning. A week later, Judge Overton walked down a street in Paris, in the same working-class neighborhood where Hippolyta and his family lived. He was on his way to check out a lead that he really hoped would reinvigorate his investigation, because over the last week, the case had completely stalled. Etienne's alibi had checked out. The inn's owner verified that Etienne had stayed there that night, and at some point he had left without paying. Now, this did not completely rule Etienne out, because he could have left his room without anyone noticing to go commit this murder, but it did make it seem much more likely that Etienne was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And since Etienne, Overton hadn't gotten any more tips about this case until that morning, when he'd gotten word that one of Hippolyta's friends was missing. This friend was a Belgian farmer named Louis Baron, who had come to France to work with Hippolyta. And this friend, Louis, hadn't been seen in over a week. Basically, since the murder, he's been missing. And so to Overton, the timing here was just too perfect to be a coincidence. And so now the judge was looking into Louis as a possible suspect who maybe skipped town after killing Hippolyta. Overton came to a stop outside of the hotel where he had heard Louis was most recently living, which happened to be just a few blocks from Hippolyta's apartment. The judge went inside and approached the front desk and asked the manager if a guest named Louis Baron had been around recently. And the manager said that yes, they definitely knew who Louis Baron was, but he hadn't been here in about a week. The manager said that the last time he had seen him, he was leaving the hotel on the night of November 2nd. And when he said that, Overton perked up, because that was the same night that Hippolyta was killed. Like, again, the coincidence was just too much here. And so the judge quickly asked the manager, what else can you tell me about Louis? What kind of person was he? Who did he hang out with? Give me anything you got. And the manager clearly didn't know Louis particularly well, but he did say that there was one person he saw Louis with all the time, and often these two people were arguing in the lobby. Now, the manager said he didn't know who this person was, but this other person that Louis fought with appeared to be a middle-aged man with blonde hair. Now, to Overton, he's thinking, clearly, you're referencing Hippolyta. That sounds like Hippolyta, this guy. And so he asked the manager, did you ever overhear what these guys were fighting about? What were the arguments about? But the manager said he really didn't know. He said that, he couldn't ever hear what they were saying. It just always seemed like when they were talking, it was like kind of heated. And he could really tell that Louis appeared to despise this other guy. Like it was much more Louis hating this guy than the other way around. The manager did tell Overton that occasionally their arguments did get so bad that it almost became violent. And in fact, the manager at one point or another had to break them up, like physically separate them. But even still, he didn't know what they were fighting about. As Overton is hearing all this new information, his mind just raced. And as he looked around at this pretty shabby hotel in a rough part of town, he realized that the robbery theory might be partly right. But instead of it being some random thief, Ippolita might have been targeted by someone he knew, like Louis. And so if this blonde-haired guy that Louis was fighting with was Ippolita, then based on what the manager was saying, it seemed pretty reasonable to assume that Louis and Ippolita didn't get along. And if Louis was an out-of-work farmhand living in a shabby hotel, it wasn't unreasonable to think that he needed money desperately. And if Louis had known that Ippolita was traveling alone to go collect this inheritance, maybe he could have made plans to meet up with him on the way back and then lured him out to the woods and killed him and taken his money and then, after ditching his body on the tracks, fled to avoid being caught. And if Louis really did have all that inheritance money on him, with all that cash, he could be anywhere by now. And so Overton realized he might never find him. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Every once in a while, something will remind me of a time when staying connected with people just felt a whole lot more effortless. There was less planning, fewer distractions, and somehow there was just way more time for the people around you. And so when I look back at those times, it's hard not to wish I had sort of appreciated those times more when they were happening. When something feels off in your life, you may find yourself thinking about a simpler time in the past when, relationships felt more natural, when being around people didn't seem to require so much effort. And then you sort of look at your current life and think, boy, it really feels different now. Staying connected in some ways is super automatic with social media and the internet, but it doesn't feel natural. It doesn't feel effortless like it used to. But what you're often missing when you look back at this time isn't just those people. It's really the experience of connection with them feeling so effortless. Therapy can help you make sense of what's changed and may also help you recognize and nurture the connection that's still very much available to you today, even if it doesn't look exactly the way it once did. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. Switch anytime at no extra cost if it's not the right fit. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/Mrballen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. A couple of weeks later, in late November of 1888, Judge Overton sat in his office at the Senlis courthouse reading a telegram from a police sergeant in Belgium. Police all over France and Belgium had been searching for Louis Baron for weeks now, but this telegram was bad news just like all the others. This one said that no one in Louis's hometown had heard from him since before Ippolita's murder, and there was still no sign of him anywhere in Belgium. Overton sighed and began flipping through a stack of notes from the investigation. Louis was the strongest suspect because he'd completely skipped town on the same day Ippolita was killed. But he also hadn't ruled out Alphonsine. She'd acted incredibly suspicious when Overton spoke to her, and now Overton had discovered that she actually might have lied to him. He'd looked into the inheritance Ippolita had supposedly gone to collect in Belgium, and he couldn't corroborate any of the details that Alphonsine had given him. So the judge had looked into this inheritance that Ippolita had supposedly gone to Belgium to collect, and so far anyways, he hadn't been able to corroborate any of the details that Alphonsine had given him. Like, they hadn't found any record of this relative who supposedly died recently and was the one passing the inheritance to Ippolita and his family. Like, this person just didn't seem to exist. And then there was Etienne, who'd been found at the literal crime scene, covered in blood. But he'd had an alibi. And since this was 1888, DNA analysis didn't exist, so Overton had no way of proving that that blood was Ippolita's or his own or somebody else's. And so as Overton was racking his brain trying to figure out what he was missing, there was a knock on his door. And so Overton got up and he opened the door and he saw a man in a nice suit standing there. And the man asked if Overton had a few minutes to chat. He said it was about Ippolita's murder. Now, Overton didn't recognize him, so he was a little confused, but he needs some leads here. He needs progress on this case. So he said, yeah, come on in, let's chat. And so they sat down and this well-dressed man explained who he was. And then he launched into this incredibly wild story that at first didn't seem to have anything to do with the murder case. Then it was like all at once, Overton realized that what this man was saying was the key to his entire case. Based on all the evidence, which included letters and witness interviews, this is what police believe happened to Ippolita Hoyos on the night of November 2nd, 1888. Around 7:20 p.m. on the evening of December 11th, 2002, a police department in a rural English county called Surrey started receiving all these frantic emergency calls. Now, all of these calls were coming from drivers on a heavily trafficked highway called the A3, and they all were saying the same things. They had seen this totally reckless driver with super bright headlights that was weaving in and out of traffic and going at high speeds and nearly crashing into people. And then a couple of the callers said they actually saw this car go down the embankment off the side of the highway, and so it looked like they might have crashed. And so, of course, this police department, after getting all these calls, decided to send out a couple of officers to see what was going on. When the two officers got out to the A3 and began patrolling the area on the A3 where all these calls were saying they had seen this reckless driver, they didn't see the driver. They didn't see a wreck on the side of the road. They didn't see any signs of an accident. I mean, there was nothing there. Now, had only one person called in about this wild, reckless driver, at this point, the officers would have chalked this up to a mistake or even a prank. But so many people called in about this one particular reckless driver on the A3 that these two officers decided to just keep on looking and really see if they can figure out where this driver went. And so to this point, the two police officers had been just driving on the A3 to try to find this driver. And so they decided they would park their vehicle, get out, and walk on foot on the edge of the highway because there were these huge forests that lined either side of the A3. In fact, Surrey, the county in England where this was one of the most heavily forested areas in all of England. And so these forests on either side of the A3 were very dense. You could not see very far into them. And so these officers were thinking that it might be possible that this driver, if they were driving as recklessly as all the callers made it seem like, they could have veered off the highway, gone down the embankment, and then because they were going at such a high speed, they could have crashed their way into one of these forests and basically disappeared from view from the road. That in order to see this crash in the forest, you'd have to be basically in the forest. And so these two officers, they pulled over, they got out, and they began walking along the edge of the highway, staring into the forest, looking for a sign of a car wreck. And sure enough, after walking for a while, one of the officers spotted something deep in the woods that looked almost metallic or plastic. Whatever it wasn't supposed to be in the forest. And so the officers made their way into the tree line and began walking through all the trees. And as they got closer, they realized very clearly there was a car. There was a wreck in the forest. And so the two officers, they begin running towards the wreck. They're calling for backup on the radio. They get to this wreck in the middle of the forest, and they're on the driver's side, and they look inside the car, and there's no driver in the driver's seat, but they looked through the car to the passenger side, and they saw the front passenger door was wide open, and on the ground on the other side of the car was very clearly a body. And so the two police officers rushed around the car to get a better look at the body. And when they did, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. It didn't make any sense. Like, what was this? Now, to understand why these police officers were so caught off guard by what they were seeing, we need to go back 5 months to July 16th, 2002. On that night, a 21-year-old man named Christopher Brian Chandler finished up his beer at a pub in West London. And for reference, where this pub was located was about 1 hour north of that stretch of the A3 highway in Surrey where the car was found in the woods. This night, Christopher had gone to this pub with a close friend of his. This was meant to be a fun night out. But, as Chris is finishing up this beer, he began to feel really antsy because it turned out Christopher was actually wanted by police in London for robbery, and so he hated staying in one place for too long. And so the only people who even knew where Christopher was the friend he was with at the bar, and then also Christopher's brother. He knew he was at this particular pub. And so finally, Christopher got so anxious about being in this pub for too long that he told the friend he was with that he just wanted to leave. And so he said goodnight to his friend. The friend stayed at the pub, and Christopher left, got in his car, and began driving south. But Christopher never arrived at the place he was trying to go. He just sort of disappeared, and nobody heard from him again. Christopher's brother eventually would report Christopher missing, but remember, the brother knows Christopher is wanted for robbery, and so Christopher suddenly going on the lam and just disappearing for a while was kind of par for the course, and so the brother really didn't think this was a big deal. And also, the police felt the same way because they know Christopher is trying to elude them, and so it makes sense he would be missing. And so as a result, nobody really followed up on Christopher's missing person report. Everybody just kind of moved on. That is, until 5 months later, when all those drivers began calling into the police in Surrey about seeing this totally reckless driver careening down the A3, who eventually crashed into a ditch. And then those two officers, they went out to that stretch of A3, and sure enough, it was Christopher's car, and the body on the ground was Christopher. However, there was a problem. When the two police officers walked up on Christopher's car and saw it for the first time, they were struck by how old it looked. But it didn't really register with them why that would matter. It just stood out to them that this is a really, really old and rusted up car. But when they went around to look at the body on the ground, Christopher's body, they saw that his body was actually mostly a skeleton, which meant Christopher did not crash and die on this night, December 11th, 2002. Very likely, he crashed and died 5 months earlier, right around the time he disappeared. Now, the Surrey police, they say that this was all just one big coincidence, that the reckless driver that all these drivers were reporting that night on the A3 must have not crashed and actually just kind of got away, and then just by coincidence, when the police were searching that area of the A3 for the reckless driver, they happened upon Chris and his car. But remember, several of the drivers who called in that night about seeing this reckless driver on the A3, they specifically said they saw the car veer off the embankment and crash down below near the tree line. Like, this is a serious crash. Someone needs to get out here with an ambulance because probably someone's hurt. And then when the police got out and searched the exact area where this crash supposedly happened, they find Chris's car that had all the hallmarks of a car that was driving recklessly on the A3 that veered off and crashed into the woods. I mean, they found Chris and his car because of these calls, but it could not have been Chris. But what other car could it have been? As of today, we do not have a good explanation for how this happened, and so it's been dubbed the A3 ghost crash. On June 1st, 1937, Amelia Earhart took off from Oakland, California on an eastbound flight around the world. It was her second attempt to become the first pilot ever to circumnavigate the globe. She, along with her flight navigator Fred Noonan, flew to Miami and then down to South America, across the Atlantic to Africa, and then east to India and Southeast Asia. The pair reached Lae, New Guinea on June 29th. A couple days later, on July 2nd, Earhart and Noonan would depart Lae, and they would make their way to tiny Howland Island, which was their next refueling stop, but they would never arrive. What Earhart was trying to accomplish at the time was such a big deal, and so when they disappeared, it was heartbreaking, and it made international headlines, and this huge search is launched for them, but they can't find them, and after 2 weeks, they officially declared they were lost at sea and most likely dead. 3 years later, and 350 miles away from Howland Island, which was the island Earhart and Noonan were trying to get to before they vanished, a British scientist was on this tiny little uninhabited island called Niku Maroro, and they made a startling discovery. He found an incomplete skeleton next to what looked like the remains of a campfire, and their skeleton was kind of torn all over the place, like they had been ripped limb from limb. Because of Niku Mororo's proximity to Howland Island, everybody speculated that this has got to be the body of either Amelia Earhart or Noonan. The bones were sent to 2 doctors in Fiji, and they unfortunately said, no, this isn't Earhart or Noonan, this is somebody else. So those bones were ultimately disposed of because no one could claim them or knew who they were, and everybody just kind of forgot about it until 2017, when a forensic anthropologist decided to manually re-examine the measurements of the bones that were taken off of Niku Mororo Island and compare them to real measurements of Amelia Earhart. And they discovered that clearly those doctors in Fiji had made a mistake, because the measurements of these bones match Amelia Earhart almost exactly. So researchers go back to Niku Mororo Island and they go to the area where these bones were found near that campfire, and they look around and they find a couple 1930s era bottles, glass bottles, and one of them is a freckle cream, and Amelia Earhart had lots of freckles and she liked to use freckle cream to cover them up. She was kind of famous for doing that. And so they found that freckle cream on this island near bones that look like they belong to Amelia Earhart. So while some scientists are putting their energy into confirming that yes, those bones were Amelia Earhart. We don't have the bones, but we can show you with the measurements and the freckle cream. And there's another picture that apparently shows the landing gear of her plane off of Niku Mororo Island. So there's some people that are working on that angle. And there's another group of scientists and researchers that are saying, okay, let's assume that that really was Amelia Earhart. Let's figure out what happened to her once she got to Niku Mororo Island. And the leading theory is horrifying. Although Niku Mororo Island is uninhabited by people, it is inhabited by one of the scariest creatures on the planet, the coconut crab. They're 3 feet long, they can carry at least 6 times their body weight, and they use their pincers that are as strong as a lion's jaw to rip open coconuts, which is their main source of food. But coconuts are not the only thing they eat. They'll also eat pigs, they'll eat each other, they'll even eat themselves. And they're prolific climbers because they need to get up to get to the coconuts. But in some parts of the world, they use their climbing ability to climb up and grab birds and break their wings with their pincers and then drag them into their underground burrows where they will eat them too. The few researchers and scientists that have gone out to Niku Mororo Island have said at night, thousands of these crabs will emerge from their underground burrows and they'll go looking for food. And they have a really keen sense of smell and they can smell blood. So when one of the crabs goes up and grabs a bird and starts ripping it apart, the thousands of others will come charging over and swarm the bird because they've smelled the blood, and they'll rip it to pieces and they'll all try to get in on the action. And so the theory goes, Earhart and Noonan are making their way to Howland Island, they get off track somehow and they wind up crash landing 350 miles away on Niku Mororo Island on one of the reefs. Noonan probably dies on impact, and Earhart, who's badly wounded and probably bleeding, she gets onto the island and she makes her way up to that area where that campfire was found. And for some amount of time, Earhart is able to survive off of whatever she had on her in those glass bottles, but in her weakened state and bleeding, at some point she probably attracted the coconut crabs who one night came out and swarmed her, ripped her to pieces, and ate her. Today, Niku Mororo Island is only inhabited by the coconut crabs and it's protected land under the Republic of Kiribati. And so if you want to go, you have to get express permission from the Republic of Kiribati, and they send someone to go with you. And there's no airport on the island, so you have to land on a separate island and then ride to Niku Mororo on a boat. But you have to pass through Cyclone Alley, which means you can only travel there at certain parts of the year, and even then it's incredibly dangerous.
You can predict the Summer Soccer Showcase action all the way to the final match with FanDuel Predicts. All you have to do is sign up to get your $25 bonus. I downloaded FanDuel Predicts during one of the matches just to try it, and let me tell you something, every play suddenly mattered way more, and every pass had a little more weight to it. It's all right there on your phone, super easy, and it kind of pulls you into the action in a way that just watching doesn't. Sign up now for your $25 bonus on FanDuel Predicts. Go to fanduel.com/predicts to sign up. That's fanduel.com/predicts to get your $25 bonus. Offered by FanDuel Prediction Markets, LLC, a registered futures commission merchant, 18+. Bonus is non-withdrawable and expires 7 days after receipt. Trading derivatives involves significant risk and may not be suitable for all investors. Manage your activity with their consumer protection tools. Restrictions apply. See terms at fanduel.com/predicts/bonus-offer-terms. At around 5 o'clock in the evening on June 25th, 1999, a man named Ricky McCormick stumbled into an emergency room in St. Louis, Missouri, with his hand over his chest, complaining that he couldn't breathe. He said he had asthma, and earlier that day he had been cutting the grass, and so maybe that had caused a flare-up. But either way, here he was in a lot of discomfort saying, I need help. Ricky was 41 years old, and for his whole life, he had had heart and lung problems, and so him arriving in this state in the ER was actually not all that uncommon for him. And so this hospital did what they did with anyone who came in complaining that they couldn't breathe. They immediately took Ricky to a back exam room and they hooked him up to all these monitors to make sure his heartbeat was steady and that his oxygen levels were plenty high. And once Ricky was in the exam room getting hooked up, he started acting really agitated and he kept looking around the room like he was scared that someone was going to jump out at him. And he was also sweating profusely, and whenever he did speak, he spoke so quickly no one could really understand him. But despite Ricky's odd behavior, the heart monitor showed his heart was beating steadily, his oxygen levels were perfectly fine, and when the doctor came in and examined Ricky, even though he clearly saw that something was off about Ricky, there wasn't any sign that there was anything physically wrong with Ricky. And so the doctor and the nurses agreed that whatever was going on with Ricky had to be psychological. And as it happened, Ricky did have a long history of psychological issues. He was known for making things up all the time, just telling people these crazy stories about himself, like how he was this talented singer and he was about to go on tour, or that he was actually a prince, or that he was studying to be a doctor. I mean, things that nobody thought was true, but Ricky would say as if this is just common knowledge. This is who I am. And so Ricky's family for the longest time had just assumed that Ricky was either bipolar or maybe schizophrenic. Those are both serious mental health disorders that totally disrupt normal thinking. But Ricky, despite being encouraged by his friends and family to go get help, never got help for any of his psychological issues. And so Ricky's life had kind of gone off the rails. He had dropped out of high school and not gone back to any sort of schooling, and he had spent some time in jail. Now, Ricky was living in a low-income, very dangerous part of St. Louis, which is a big Midwestern city on the Mississippi River that in 1999 had a very serious issue with gang violence. Ricky absolutely hated it there, but he had no way to actually leave St. Louis. In fact, Ricky didn't even have his own place. He bounced around from his mother's place, his aunt's place, and his girlfriend's place. Ricky did work, but the work was very sporadic, and it was for the most part just night shifts for random odd jobs. And when Ricky was actually working, he really just spent his time chain smoking cigarettes and drinking literally gallons of coffee. Back at the ER, Ricky, who was still in the exam room, had only been there for less than an hour when the doctor came back in and told Ricky that he was okay and he was going to be discharged. Now, Ricky immediately said, no, I have to be here tonight. I need to stay here. You need to admit me. But the doctor just kind of ignored what he said and handed him the discharge paperwork. 15 minutes later, when a nurse came back into the exam room to get this paperwork from Ricky, she would walk in and see Ricky still sitting on the exam bed, kind of fidgeting around, looking down at this paperwork on his lap that immediately she saw he had not filled out. He had just signed his name at the bottom. And when she walked in, Ricky looked up at her and he kind of shrugged his shoulders and looked at her and was like, "I don't know how to read or write. Can you help me?" And so the nurse immediately felt bad for Ricky. I mean, he's got dirty clothes on, he looks thin and frail, he's clearly very down on his luck, there's some issues happening with this guy, and he can't even fill out his discharge paperwork. And so she said, no problem. She sat down with him, and together they filled out his paperwork. And then afterwards, when she walked him out of the exam room back to the front of the hospital, Ricky turned to her and said, instead of going home, can you just let me stay here in the lobby just for tonight? And this nurse, who knew she was not allowed to do this, she looked around and saw it was not a busy night there. And so she said, okay, as long as you don't bother anyone, you can stay here. And so Ricky thanked her repeatedly and then walked over to the corner, kind of far away from the front desk and far away from the front door. And he sat down and folded his arms, and then he just stared at the front door. And so this nurse assumed that Ricky actually must be homeless, especially based on, how he came in and how he was acting. And so she figured, he needs a place that's warm to stay tonight. And so the nurse went back to her station, and over the course of the next several hours, she would periodically look out into the lobby, expecting to see Ricky kind of curled up asleep in the corner. But every time she looked out there, Ricky was still sitting upright, arms folded, staring at the front door of the hospital as if he was expecting someone to come in at any moment and he needed to be ready. And so she thought this was unusual, but she decided not to intervene. She just let him sit there and do his thing. Later that morning at 11:30 a.m., when the nice nurse who had allowed Ricky to stay in the lobby was leaving her shift, another crew of nurses came in, and right away they noticed Ricky was just sitting in the corner for no apparent reason. And when they walked up to him to ask if he was okay, what are you doing here? What can we do for you? Ricky, instead of trying to talk to any of these nurses, just got up and walked out of the hospital. After leaving the hospital, Ricky walked to a nearby payphone and he called his girlfriend, Sandy. And when Sandy picked up the phone, she immediately recognized her boyfriend's very familiar voice, but she also picked up that he sounded really tired and kind of out of it. And so when she asked him, are you okay? What's going on? Ricky would tell her that he had just spent the night in the hospital. But he didn't clarify that he had spent the night in the lobby of the hospital, not admitted as a patient at the hospital. But to Sandy, it really didn't matter because already this was raising red flags for her because this was actually the second time that Ricky had gone to the ER just that week. Just a few days earlier, Ricky had been released from a different hospital in St. Louis after telling doctors there that he had had these chest pains and he couldn't breathe. And so he had been admitted for a couple of days, but ultimately they determined that there really was nothing wrong with him. And they too believed whatever was happening with him had to be psychological. And so he had been released. Additionally, Sandy had been growing increasingly worried about Ricky because over the last several weeks, Ricky had begun acting really paranoid to the point where anytime he was in her apartment and somebody outside the apartment just walked down the hallway, Ricky would jump as if he was worried whoever was out there was going to barge in at any moment. But whenever Sandy asked Ricky, what's going on? Why are you so paranoid? He refused to elaborate. So, feeling very concerned about Ricky, on this phone call, Sandy would say to Ricky, please come to my apartment and let me take care of you. If you're not feeling well, I'll make you feel better. Just please come to my apartment right now. But Ricky said no, he did not want to go to Sandy's apartment. He told her instead he was going to walk to a nearby gas station to get a bite to eat, and then afterwards he would give Sandy a call. And so the two of them agreed to this plan. They hung up. But then Ricky did not call Sandy later. A worker at the gas station where Ricky said he was going would later tell authorities that Ricky did come into the gas station and he got a hot dog on that day, the 26th. And then the next day, this same worker said, yep, we saw Ricky again on the 27th. He came in here, he got a bite to eat, and then he left. But after that, nobody saw Ricky. Not his aunt, not his mom, not his girlfriend. He didn't show up in any other emergency rooms in Missouri. He just disappeared. On June 30th, so 3 days after Ricky was last seen at this gas station, a woman was driving her car 20 miles north of St. Louis on this highway when she looked out into this cornfield that butted up against the highway, and she saw kind of in the middle of it was this dark shape that looked totally out of place. And so she was intrigued enough that she actually pulled over on the road, she got out, and began walking into this cornfield to see what this thing was. And when she got up to this thing and saw what it was, she froze in horror, and then she screamed, turned around, and ran back to her car, and she flew to the nearest gas station, she grabbed a payphone, and she called 911. When the police arrived at this cornfield, they too walked out towards this dark thing, and then finally they saw what this thing was that had scared this woman. It was a dead person who was lying face down. Their body was very badly decomposed. And in fact, their body was just kind of falling apart, like the fingers of this person's body had just kind of crumpled off of their hands. Now, based on what this person was wearing, they appeared to be male, but there was no way to tell how this person died or really how long they had been dead for. But despite the advanced decomposition, authorities were able to get a good fingerprint, and it would turn out that this body belonged to Ricky McCormick. The day after Ricky's body was found, the police would come out and say they were treating his death as a homicide. This area along this highway in this cornfield was actually a fairly common place for murderers to dump their victims. And it was very unlikely that Ricky had gotten there by himself. He didn't have a car. In fact, he didn't even have a driver's license. There was no public transportation that could have brought him to this spot. And if Ricky had decided to walk to this area for some reason, it was a solid 15 miles from where he lived and worked. Also, Ricky's body was way too decomposed relative to when he had last been seen alive, just 3 days earlier. And so there was a theory that perhaps he was killed somewhere else and then kept indoors in heat, and that had accelerated his decomposition, and that at some point whoever had killed him had moved his body and dumped it in this cornfield. And so on that first day of the homicide investigation, July 1st, the police put 18 detectives, so a ton of detectives, on this case, and they also appealed to the public to come forward if you had any information about what could have happened to Ricky McCormick. But just a day later, on July 2nd, the police came out and made an announcement that, after looking at all the evidence and looking at Ricky's body again, it did not appear, in fact, that he had been murdered, but instead he must have died of natural causes. This is a guy that had lung and heart problems, and so that is likely what killed him. Case closed. And so after this announcement, all of the evidence in Ricky's case was bundled up, put into storage, and people just kind of forgot about it. 6 months later, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, got a tip that involved Ricky McCormick. They were working on a case in St. Louis, Missouri about this major drug dealer who apparently was ordering hits on his rivals, and a confidential informant came forward and told the FBI that this guy, Ricky McCormick, had gotten wrapped up with this major drug dealer. But they didn't really know what role Ricky was playing with this drug dealer. It was just kind of a rumor on the street that, Ricky was involved somehow. This did not make any sense to the FBI because they're thinking, why would this big-time drug dealer who really was a mover and shaker in St. Louis get involved with this guy, Ricky McCormick, who was obviously deeply mentally ill and borderline homeless? I mean, what role could Ricky play for this drug dealer? But the FBI still did follow up on this tip because it was very credible. And when they spoke to the local police who had investigated Ricky's death, they got Ricky's file, which meant they got all of the evidence. And immediately the FBI realized the local police had overlooked a very strange piece of evidence found in Ricky's pocket. This strange evidence was quickly sent to FBI headquarters in Quantico, Virginia, and it landed on the desk of a forensic analyst named Dan Olson. Dan was relatively new to the FBI, but he was highly disciplined and very methodical. And so when he received this piece of evidence, he got to work right away trying to figure out what it was, what it meant in relationship to Ricky and this drug dealer. And, maybe does it answer the question of how these people are connected? But despite his best efforts and calling in the experts and using every computer program to analyze this evidence, he just could not figure out what it meant. At the same time that Dan was doing this, the big drug dealer who was the target of that big FBI investigation in St. Louis was arrested on gun and drug charges. And so the big case was now over. And suddenly trying to figure out what connection Ricky McCormick had to this drug dealer was kind of irrelevant because the drug dealer was behind bars and Ricky was already dead. And so the FBI kind of put a pause on trying to figure out what this evidence was. And so Dan, even though he was really curious now, he was fully invested in trying to figure out what this thing was, he realized he had to give it up too and move on to something else. And so the strange evidence went back into storage, and once again, everyone just kind of moved on from Ricky McCormick. But Dan never really forgot about this mystifying piece of evidence. It was always in the back of his mind. 22 years later, Dan Olson had now become very senior at the FBI. He was actually in charge of their cryptanalysis and racketeering unit. Basically, he was in charge of the people at the FBI who specialized in code breaking, meaning they were the people that would pull any sort of secret messages embedded inside of evidence. And so at some point after taking over this unit, Dan pulled out of storage this strange piece of evidence connected to Ricky McCormick. And he said, you know what? I just need to know what this means. I have to figure it out. I've never been able to. It's haunted me ever since. And so Dan went public. He went to the media and he asked the world to take a look at this mystifying piece of evidence and come forward if you have any idea what it means. When Ricky was discovered in that cornfield, the local police quickly emptied his pockets, and in his pants pocket were 2 documents that contained an incredibly complex cipher or code. It was basically 30 lines on each piece of paper with different symbols and letters and capital letters. I mean, it looked like total gibberish to the untrained eye. But to people like Dan and his code-breaking team, these symbols and letters could mean there was a secret message hidden inside of these documents if you could break the code system. But of course, no one could ever break that code. So how in the world does a guy like Ricky, who is basically functionally illiterate and can only write his name, he's clearly mentally ill and he's not really in touch with reality all the time, how does a guy like that come to be in possession of these complex ciphers? And if he didn't write these ciphers, because that's possible, maybe somebody else gave them to Ricky, well, why would anyone who came up with this very complex cipher entrust a guy like Ricky to be the one to carry these things around? I mean, presumably, they contain confidential information that's been very carefully hidden inside of the cipher. And so why give it to Ricky? He's such a liability. And also, what happened to Ricky in that cornfield? I mean, we don't even know how he got there. We don't know how he was killed. All we know is that he had these ciphers in his pocket when he was found. And so many people believe, including law enforcement, that the answer to, what happened to Ricky and what was his connection to this drug lord in St. Louis, if any, or, what was he up to, will all be solved if we can just figure out what these 2 ciphers mean. But as of right now, no one has solved the riddle of what these 2 ciphers mean. All we know is that Ricky McCormick, a couple of weeks before he died, became increasingly paranoid and was so scared of someone or something that he was likely running into these hospitals just to hide out. But eventually, whoever or whatever Ricky was scared of very likely caught up to him and killed him. But until we crack these ciphers, we very likely will have no idea what actually happened to Ricky McCormick. Today, the FBI has set up a special website where you can look at these 2 ciphers that Ricky had in his pocket, and if you're able to crack them, because someone's going to eventually, you can tell the FBI through this website and potentially help solve Ricky's murder. At 5 a.m. on September 30th, 2008, a 61-year-old man named Xian Tie-xiong finished getting dressed inside of the bedroom that he shared with his wife in the city of Beijing, China. After he finished getting dressed, Xian reached down and scooped up his backpack off the floor that was already packed, and then he carefully walked around his bed, trying to be as quiet as possible, and then as quietly as he could, he kind of tiptoed around the bed to his wife's side to give her a kiss goodbye. Xian was going to be heading out to a local mountain that day for a day hike. And so Xian, he gets next to his wife and he bends down to kiss her, and right as he does that, he accidentally wakes her up. And so his wife opens her eyes and she looks up at him, and Xian just says, I love you. He gives her a kiss and he tells her, hey, I'll be back tonight before midnight. And so his wife, she kind of groggily said, okay, and she grabbed his hand and squeezed it, and she told him that she loved him, and then she fell back asleep, and moments later, Xian had left the bedroom and walked out the front door. Xian's home was only a couple of blocks away from the train station, and since he needed to ride a train and then also a bus to get to this local mountain that was about an hour-and-a-half journey away, the train station was his first stop. And so Xian, as he walked towards the station, he was all smiles. He was really excited about this day. So Zhen was retired, but he had spent his whole life teaching geography at Beijing No. 5 Middle School. And he was a very passionate teacher, but the thing he was most passionate about, that he routinely really pushed on his students, in some ways more than geography, was his love of nature. In fact, Xian loved nature so much that when he was not teaching, he basically spent all of his off time out in nature going for hikes. That was his thing. And today, Jian was especially excited about his hike because he was hiking one of his favorite trails. It was located on Mount Miaofeng, which is a mountain located 30 miles to the northwest of where Jian lived. And this mountain was quite famous because of all the sacred and ancient temples that kind of dotted the mountain all over the place. And then also there were all these beautiful roses, like the flower, that would bloom all over the mountain in the summer. And so it's just this totally strikingly beautiful place. And normally Jian would actually hike up this trail and then actually camp out on Mount Miaofeng, mostly because on the summit, there was this incredible view of downtown Beijing. And at night, the view is like spectacular with the city all lit up. But on this particular day, Jian knew an overnight stay was not possible because he had to be back home by the next day because it was his mother's 90th birthday. And he was very close with his mother and he was not going to miss that. And so Jian eventually made it to the train station. He bought his ticket, he boarded his train, and then he sat down in a seat. And as soon as he did, he opened up his bag and pulled out a stack of papers. For this hike, Jian had packed himself some food and water inside of his backpack. He also packed a newspaper called the Beijing Youth Daily, and he brought along his diary. But his diary was a little bit unique. Jian, because he loved nature so much and didn't like the idea of wasting anything, what he would do when he was a teacher at Beijing No. 5 Middle School, he would just take scrap paper and start writing on that. And he would compile all his scrap paper into these sort of diaries that he would keep. And so the reason he did that was primarily because he was so in love with nature, he hated the idea of wasting anything. And so Jian passed the time on the train by writing in his diary, aka his stack of scrap paper, and also reading this newspaper. And Jian knew he really needed to read the entire newspaper pretty quickly because by the time he got to the mountain, he was going to do what he always did, which is he would bring a newspaper with him on a hike, and as he walked, he would take out a page periodically and tie it to a tree, kind of marking his way. That way, when he turned around and came back down, he would have his path marked, because Jian did not always walk on a clearly marked trail, and so this was his way of not getting lost. And so Jian would ride the train car, and then he would get off and he would board a bus. And then finally, right around 7 a.m., that bus would come to a stop in the tiny village of Changfang, which is located right at the base of Mount Miaofeng. And so Jian grabbed his backpack, he hopped off the bus, and then began walking through the village towards the mountain. And then by about 7:20 a.m., so not long after Jian had left the bus, he was almost up to Mount Miaofeng when he pulled out his cell phone and he called his cousin. It was a brief conversation, and all Jian really wanted to do was just to make sure his cousin was going to be around the next day for Jian's mother's birthday. And the cousin said he would, and so Jian told him, okay, I'm going hiking today, and I will see you tomorrow. And then he hung up. And then, only a couple minutes later, Jian disappeared into the beautiful forests of Mount Miaofeng. So Jian's wife did not expect to hear from Jian at any point that day because she knew he would have terrible cell phone service up on the mountain. But she did expect her husband to be home on time. He had told her that morning before he left that he would be home that night before midnight. And if you knew Jian, you knew this guy was never late. He said, I'm going to be someplace at a certain time. He would be there. So when 10 p.m. rolled around that night and still Jian was not back yet and he had not called, Jian's wife was actually not worried because she was thinking, okay, well, it's 10. He'll be home in the next couple of hours because he said he'd be here by midnight tonight and he will be here tonight. And so she went to bed expecting to wake up and see Jian in bed with her in the morning. But the next morning when she woke up, Jian was not in bed, so he did not come home, and so his wife immediately was very concerned and began calling Jian's family, and nobody knew where he was. And so that day, the family went to the police, and they reported Jian missing. The local police immediately organized a search for Jian. However, they knew this was going to be a very challenging search. Mount Miaofeng is not some enormous mountain by any means. It's a decent-sized mountain, but it's really known for having these paths that twist and turn all over the place, so it's pretty easy to get lost. And then also there's a whole bunch of sheer cliff faces kind of all over the place, so if you're not paying attention, you could literally just walk off a ledge. So in short, this is a dangerous and confusing place. And at the same time that this search was happening out on the mountain, the police were also in contact with Jian's cell phone service provider to see if they could track down Jian's cell phone, because obviously if they could find that, they might find Jian too. But the only way a cell phone can be tracked is if the cell phone is on, because when it's on, it connects to the nearest cell phone tower, and that's how these service providers are able to tell where these phones are. They look to see which tower it's connected to. But when Jian's cell phone service provider looked for his phone, they quickly determined his phone was off. So unless the phone came back on again, they would not be able to locate the phone. However, they were able to pull all of Jian's cell phone signal history up until his phone was turned off. And what they found in this signal history is the day before, so the day Jian went missing, his cell phone was on at 4 p.m. that evening, and he received a phone call at 4 p.m. And the service provider was able to see that when this phone call came in, Jian's cell phone was not where they thought it would be. It was not high up Mount Miaofeng. It actually was near the base of the mountain. And when police reached out to the person who had called Jian at 4 p.m., they discovered it was just a friend of Jian's, and this friend said that Jian said he was coming down the mountain now and he'd be home soon. So this new information did basically line up with what Jian had told his family he'd be doing that day, just a quick day hike. Although again, they kind of expected it to be a little bit longer. It seemed a little odd he'd be down the mountain by 4 p.m., but still, this basically lined up with what they thought he was doing. However, this new information did not help explain what happened to Jian. Like, why was he missing? The expectation was he must have gotten lost or hurt or something up on this mountain. Maybe he's stranded somewhere and can't go anywhere. But now, based on this phone call, it sounded an awful lot like Jian was not even on the mountain when he disappeared. So where was he? Police had already checked all the bus stations and train stations in the area, to see if maybe Jian took a different way home or something. But when they went to all these different stations, there was no evidence that Jian had been to any of them. And there was another problem. Members of Jian's family told the police about Jian's habit of tying newspapers to trees to mark his trail as he hiked. And the family told the police that Jian did this every single time he hiked. And his wife told the police that for sure she knew her husband had brought along a copy of that newspaper. So by all expectations, there should be markers up on that mountain, literally leading searchers to wherever Jian went. But after an entire day of searching Mount Miaofeng, they didn't find a single newspaper anywhere. For the next several days, this big search for Jian continued, but nothing was found. That is, until October 7th, so 1 week after Jian had vanished. On that day, Jian's cell phone service provider noticed that Jian's cell phone had suddenly turned back on. And the phone was not on or near Mount Miaofeng. Instead, it was located 36 miles away from the mountain at a train station called Beijing West Railway Station. Now, the cell phone was only on for a couple of seconds, but it was on long enough for the provider to confirm that it really was in that location. And so the police immediately dispatched a team to go to Beijing West Railway Station and see if they could find Jian. But when they got there, Jian was not there. His phone was not there. They looked at all the security footage. There was no sign of Jian. They searched the surrounding areas. Nothing. And on this day, at basically the same time that police are at this railway station trying to make sense of, what's going on with the cell phone, a villager from Chanfang village, which is that little village that sits at the base of Mount Miaofeng, came forward with a very strange story. He said on the day that Jian disappeared, this villager was at his little shop. He sold walnuts to hikers that were making their way towards Mount Miaofeng. It was basically like snacks for the hike. And he sees this guy walking up through the village towards the mountain, and he looked exactly like Jian, because now Jian's face was on the news and this villager had seen it, and so he felt like he had seen Jian. And so this villager said, this guy who looked exactly like Jian, he walked up and actually stopped at this villager's shop to buy some walnuts. And this villager and this man who looked like Jian, they just chatted for a few minutes, and at some point, this guy who looked like Jian, asked the villager, hey, these are great, but where else can I buy walnuts? I want to buy other types of walnuts and bring them back to my family. And so this villager was like, oh yeah, well, the best walnuts in all of Beijing are actually located about 30 miles away at the base of another mountain. It's called Tietua Mountain, and there are vendors over there who sell the best walnuts. So that's your answer right over there. And then after the villager said this, this guy who looked just like Jian, it's like everything changed for him. It's like his expression changed, his tone changed. It's like he's been given this information that's changed his life, about these walnuts. And he says to the villager, okay, I'm going to go there right now. And without saying anything else, this man just turned and began quickly walking away from the walnuts, back through town, back towards the bus stop. So away from Mount Miaofeng. In theory, this guy is going to the bus to what? Commute 30 miles to this other mountain, Tietua Mountain, to get these walnuts? I mean, the villager does not know this guy, but even he felt like this is bizarre. This guy comes up, he's buying snacks to go hike Mount Miaofeng. He seems really excited about it. And I offhandedly mention these walnuts, and he's like, boom, I'm out of here. I'm going to go 30 miles to this other mountain to get these walnuts. It just seemed weird. And then when police spoke to Jian's family about this new information, they would learn that Jian did not have a special interest in walnuts, and neither did his family. And even if there was a reason why Jian just really wanted these walnuts, he would not have had time in that day to take the bus 30 miles to Tietua Mountain, get these walnuts, go 30 miles back, and hike up Mount Miaofeng, because he can't stay the night. He needs to come back tonight in order to go to his mother's birthday party the next day. So it just made no sense. But this walnut thing was basically the only lead police really had, because everything else was a dead end. And so they decided to shift their search area from Mount Miaofeng to Tietua Mountain. And pretty much right away, they saw something that gave them hope that Jian could be here. They found pages from the Beijing Youth Daily newspaper tied to trees on the mountain. And when they looked more closely at the newspapers, they found the publication date of this newspaper lined up with the copy that Jian would have had with him on the day he vanished. And so, of course, the searchers just began following this trail of newspapers, hoping Jian would be at the other end. For 2 days, searchers very diligently followed this trail up the mountain. It kind of wound around, and they went pretty slowly because as they're moving, they're constantly checking everything around. They don't want to miss any clues. But finally, after 2 days of following this trail, they eventually found something. The newspapers led them to a campsite. Now, the campsite was abandoned, but there was a bed of hay, there was some used water bottles, and some toilet paper. And so just from the looks of it, this campsite looked relatively active, like somebody had been staying here recently for at least a day or two. And so it seemed pretty likely, based on everything else, that this was Jian's campsite. And pretty quickly, after searching the campsite, they found something that virtually guaranteed that this was his campsite. Authorities found this plastic bag that was sitting next to the bed, and inside of the bag was a piece of scrap paper from Beijing No. 5 Middle School. And on this scrap paper was a note. And the note said Jian had indeed hiked up Tietua Mountain on September 30th. This would have been the day that he left, so the day he disappeared. And then on his way down, he said he got lost and was forced to spend the night out here. And so that explained the campsite. And then on October 1st, so that would have been the day after he spent the night out here, he said he was going to attempt to follow the ridge line down the mountain to a nearby village to safety. And this note ended with the phrase, "Leaving this note here just in case. Love to everyone who passes by." Now, at first glance, this note was like amazing news because suddenly it seemed totally possible that Jian was just fine. I mean, the way the note was written, it sounded like he was at least healthy and safe, albeit I'm sure he was not happy to be stuck up on a mountain, but, he loved being in nature, and so he seemed okay. And then he had a reasonable plan for how he was going to get out of there, follow the ridgeline, go down to a village, go to safety. But as the police analyzed this note, they noticed that some things were off about it. First of all, this note basically directly contradicts other facts of this case. Remember, cell phone records prove Jian got a phone call at 4 p.m. on the day he went missing from his friend, and his friend would report that Jian told him that he was coming down Mount Miaofeng and he'd be home soon. But according to the note they found, that was not possible because the note said Jian at 4 p.m. on September 30th, the day he went missing, he would have been on Tietua Mountain, either hiking up or being in the process of getting lost and, ultimately making that campsite where he camped out for at least one night. And so in addition to this factual discrepancy with this note, another issue with the note was just the way it was written. Now, Jian's wife had a chance to look at the note and she would say, "That is my husband's handwriting." But the note contained a bunch of very strange language choices that just didn't make sense for Jian to be using. For example, this note, which really should have been a first-person point of view, Jian has gotten lost, he's by himself, he's writing to the world, kind of letting somebody know what's going on with him, and so it really should have been written in the first person. My name is Jian, I am lost, here's what I'm doing. But the note was written in the third person. Jian got lost on the mountain, and so he is going to camp out for the night, and tomorrow he's going to make his way out to safety. But despite being written in the third person, it did sound like somebody was talking about themselves. It did not feel like somebody else was attempting to document what Jian was doing. But by far, the weirdest part of this note was the tone shift that happened about halfway through. So the first half of this letter was written, albeit in the third person, but it was grammatically correct and sort of formal, like you would expect from a very well-educated retired teacher. But once you get to that second half of the note, the grammar started being really awkward, and then the very final line, which says, "Love to everyone who passes by," that actually sounds totally awkward in Chinese. So love to everyone who passes by is the translation into English, and that basically makes sense to us, like that's not an awkward phrase. But if you put it back in Chinese, it's so awkward. It would be like if I tried to say to you, I take the bus to work, but instead I said, to work, take bus, right? Like I wouldn't say it that way, and it would immediately seem very awkward for anybody who knows me if I wrote or said something like that. And so this last line stood out so much that actually police and friends and family of Jian assumed he must have left that in there as like a secret message or a code, like a distress signal, especially when you consider the other weird factors around this note. But nobody could figure out what it meant. The day after this note was discovered, a searcher was up in the vicinity of Jian's campsite on Tietua Mountain, and they were walking around, kind of retracing their footsteps, looking for new places to search. When they turned a corner, and up ahead, they noticed there was this tree kind of hanging out over this rocky cliff, and dangling from the tree was something gray that looked sort of out of place. And so the searcher, sensing this could be a clue of Jian's whereabouts, he yelled out for other searchers in the area that he had found something, and then he took off running towards this thing to see what it was. And when he got up to the tree, he looked up and he saw it was a pair of sweatpants that had clearly been intentionally tied to this branch in the tree. And so the searcher, he reached up and grabbed one of the pant legs and kind of tugged on it. And when he did, all these white things began falling out of the pants and landing on the ground. And when the searcher stopped and looked down to see what they were, he couldn't believe it. It was a whole pile of human bones. However, they were not Jian's. In fact, nobody ever figured out who these bones belonged to or why they were stuffed inside of pants and tied to a tree on this mountain. But the discovery of these bones would open up a whole new mystery, because after these bones were found, all the searchers came over and basically just began combing the area near these bones, and the police began uncovering body after body after body. They found 2 more sets of human bones stuffed into pants and tied to trees, and they found the other bodies at the foot of a cliff, and also inside of this well, and inside of this cave. And so in total, authorities found 10 sets of human remains in the vicinity near Jian's campsite, but none of the human remains belonged to Jian. Officials were only able to identify a few of the bodies, and they were not able to figure out how they died or whether or not foul play was involved. But the discovery of those bodies did mean one thing for Jian's case. It meant, all these people had previously gone up Tietua Mountain before Jian went up and vanished. And when these other people went up the mountain, clearly something horrible happened to them, and we don't know what it is. Is there a killer on the loose? Is there some animal or creature out there that's taken people out? We don't know. But what started to happen since Jian went missing and his story was all over the news in China is that all these other hikers who've been on Tietua Mountain before have begun sharing their experiences when they hiked up Tietua Mountain, and some of their stories about what they've seen on that mountain are horrifying. One person said they were walking up the mountain, they had their partner with them who was a little bit farther back the trail, and so they're kind of walking up on their own, and the first person, as they're walking up the trail, suddenly sees this guy just kind of come out of nowhere wielding an axe, and he walks up to this person, and all he says is, "Are you alone?" And the hiker's like, no, my partner's back there. They're coming up here. What's going on? But the Axeman, he basically acted like he didn't even hear their answer. And he just asked it again. Are you alone? And the hiker was like, no, my partner's back there. And the Axeman again just said, are you alone? Are you alone? Are you alone? And this axe person kept doing that until the hiker and their partner just turned and ran. And then another hiker shared a story about how they were walking up a trail on Tiatua Mountain, and at some point they lifted their head up, and he saw a little ways up the trail, kind of off the trail, so in the tree line, were all these people, like this group of strangers, just standing there motionless, kind of half behind trees, like they were kind of trying to hide themselves, but also not. And they were just staring at this hiker, unmoving, not speaking, just staring. And so the hiker, they look up and they see this, and they were so unnerved so quickly that they just turned and left, and they have no idea who those people were. And so obviously we have no way of verifying these other hikers' stories about what they saw on Tiatua Mountain. But when you combine their testimony with Jian's story, it really makes you wonder, what's going on up there? The official search for Jian was called off at the end of October, so roughly 1 month after he vanished. But unofficially, the search for Jian continues to this day. However, they still have not found his body, and basically no real progress has been made. At 12:30 p.m. on March 7th, 2015, a police officer named Tyler Beddoes, along with his partner, were driving in his police cruiser near the Spanish Fork River in Utah when suddenly a police dispatcher came on over the radio. And this dispatcher was speaking very urgently and said, hey, a fisherman has just called in to say that he spotted what looks like an upturned SUV partially submerged in the Spanish Fork River right underneath the bridge. And whoever is closest to this bridge, get over there and see if there's anybody inside the vehicle that can be saved. And so Officer Beddoes and his partner, they knew they were very near this bridge. And so immediately they banged a U-turn, they drove to the bridge, but from the road, they looked down and couldn't see any SUV. But they saw there were some firefighters and paramedics that were also converging at the spot on the road, and everybody's getting out and running down to the riverbank. And so Beddoes and his partner did the same thing. They got out and they ran down. And then finally, when they got to the riverbank and they saw underneath this bridge, sure enough, there was this red SUV, upturned, partially submerged, and he noticed right away that none of the doors had been opened in this SUV, and so it meant whoever was driving this vehicle when it flipped over very likely was still inside. And so Officer Beddoes and his partner and the other first responders just jumped into this icy cold river and began making their way closer and closer to this upturned SUV, which again, it's not fully submerged. It's like a third of the way underwater. So if you were sitting in the seat inside of this vehicle and you were an adult, your head would basically be in the water if you were still strapped into the seat. And as they're making their way towards this SUV, when they got close enough, they began hearing a woman inside of the vehicle screaming, hey, we're in here, come over here, help! But when Officer Beddoes and the rest of the first responders actually reached the SUV, the water was so murky and it basically completely covered up the windows that they weren't really able to look into the vehicle. They could just hear this woman yelling, but that was it. And then when they tried to open up the doors, they couldn't do it because the roof had begun to cave in, and so the actual framing of the door wouldn't open. And so all these first responders, it's like their adrenaline's pumping and they're like, come on, we got to push this thing up onto its side so we can get in. And so all these first responders are pushing, and slowly but surely they began to raise the side of this vehicle up until the windows suddenly were clear, and Officer Beddoes and the others were able to look into the car, and they saw there was a woman in the driver's seat and there was a baby in a car seat dangling upside down in the back seat, still strapped in. And so Beddoes began screaming, there's a baby in here, there's a baby in here. And suddenly it was like everybody got extra strength and they pushed this vehicle all the way up onto its side. And then one of the firefighters climbed up onto the side of the car, which now was the highest point of the car. And he reached in and he clipped these straps holding the baby who had been upside down, dangling there, cut the straps and pulled the baby out and handed the baby over to Officer Beddoes. And then the firefighter began doing the same thing to get the woman out. But Officer Beddoes at this point, he just took this baby, he He turned away. He figured the first responders will handle this woman, and he's going to take this baby to safety because he couldn't even tell if the baby was alive or not. And so he's cradling this baby. He's rushing back through the water, back to the riverbank, and then he hands the baby over to the paramedics. And right as he does, he sees this little baby begins to move its arms and flicker its eyes, and he wanted to weep out of relief that this child was okay. They put the baby onto a stretcher, they put the baby in the ambulance, and they whisked the baby away to the hospital where this baby would survive. But after the baby had been taken away, Officer Beddoes turned his attention back to the SUV and back to the woman to see how she was doing. But he could tell right away from the way people were acting, all the other first responders that were still dealing with the crisis in the water, the way they were acting indicated that something is off here. Well, it would turn out 14 hours earlier, so at around 10 p.m. the previous night, a 28-year-old woman named Jennifer Gorsbeck had just left her father's house in Salem, Utah, and in her car was her little 18-month-old baby, Lily, who was in the back seat. And after Jennifer pulled away from her father's house and her father's on the porch waving to her, she began driving towards her home. But something happened around 10:30 p.m. that night. We don't know what, but something caused Jennifer to careen off the road on that bridge and flip over and land in the water. Maybe she fell asleep at the wheel or an animal jumped out, we don't know, but we know at 10:30 she careens off the bridge and she lands in that river. And then for 14 hours, she and her baby remained upside down in that river. Until finally, Officer Beddoes and the other first responders came rushing over to open it up and get them out of there. And if you recall, all the first responders, Officer Beddoes included, heard Jennifer screaming that they were in the car, come save us, please. But what they would find out is that could not have been Jennifer, because Jennifer was killed on impact when the car fell into the water. Only Lily survived the crash, and then Lily, who's nearly hypothermic and she's upside down with water like 2 inches away from her head, for 14 hours she dangled there, and when she was pulled out, according to doctors, was like a couple of minutes before she would have died from hypothermia. And so without that voice, Lily almost certainly would have died, because it was the sound of that voice that really encouraged all these first responders to find the strength and get that car up on its side and then get the baby out of there. We don't know whose voice that belonged to, but for sure, it saved Lily's life. And again, baby Lily would make a full recovery, and to this day, Officer Beddoes and the other first responders, they know what they heard, and they do not have an explanation for it.